Garrett Rowan had buried his wife 6 months ago, and he thought he'd buried everything else with her: hope, purpose, the will to fight. But when he rode home through the failing light and found smoke rising from his cold chimney, lamplight glowing where only darkness should be, and a beautiful Chinese woman standing in his kitchen with bruises on her face and fire in her eyes, everything changed. She didn't ask for charity, she offered a bargain. 3 nights of work for 3 nights of shelter. He should have sent her away. Instead, he let her stay, and that decision would ignite a war that would shake the entire territory. If you're ready to see how one chance encounter can tear down an empire of lies, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Montana sky had turned the color of a fading bruise by the time Garrett Rowan finally spotted the roofline of his ranch breaking the horizon. Another day gone. Another stretch of fence repaired on the Hendersons' land because they were too old to do it themselves and too proud to ask for help outright. Another evening riding home to a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. His horse, a grizzled bay gelding named Flint, knew the way without guidance. Garrett let the reins hang loose, his shoulders curved forward under the weight of exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. The ache lived deeper than muscle and bone. It had taken root the day they lowered Eleanor into the ground, and in the 6 months since, it had only spread. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested the final rise. Barn first, then the main house, then the scattered out buildings that marked the boundaries of what had once been a thriving operation. Now it was just land, just structures, just a place where a man went through motions because stopping would mean acknowledging how completely everything had fallen apart. Garrett was 50 yards from the barn when he noticed the smoke. It rose in a thin gray column from the chimney, darker against the twilight sky. For a moment, his mind simply rejected what his eyes were seeing. The chimney hadn't drawn smoke since February, since before Eleanor took sick, since before the world had tilted sideways and refused to right itself. Flint's ears pricked forward. Then Garrett saw the light, warm and golden, spilling from the kitchen window across the dirt yard like an invitation he hadn't extended. His hand moved to the rifle in its saddle scabbard before conscious thought caught up. He wasn't a violent man by nature, but Montana in 1887 was hard country, and a man learned to be ready for trouble whether he courted it or not. He dismounted 20 feet from the house, his boots hitting packed earth with barely a sound. The rifle came free, smooth, and quiet. Every sense had sharpened the way it did when something wasn't right, when the world had shifted just enough off-center that a man needed to pay attention or pay a price. The front door stood slightly ajar. Garrett approached from the side, keeping his footsteps light, his breathing controlled. Through the window, he could see movement in the kitchen, a figure, slender and quick, moving with purpose between the stove and the table. Not a drifter, then. Drifters didn't cook. He reached the door and pushed it open with the rifle barrel. The woman turned to face him without a hint of surprise, as if she'd been expecting him all along. She was Chinese, perhaps 30 years old, with thick black hair pulled back in a practical braid that hung past her shoulders. Her dress had seen better days. The fabric was quality, but torn at the hem and stained with travel dust. A bruise darkened her left cheekbone, purple-black and recent enough that the edges still carried an angry red. Her eyes were dark and direct, meeting his without flinching, without the fear he'd expected to see. "Mr. Rowan," she said. Her English carried an accent but moved with careful precision. "My name is Maylene Zhao. I apologize for the intrusion." Garrett stood frozen in his own doorway, rifle still raised, his mind struggling to catch up with a situation that made no sense whatsoever. "How do you know my name?" The question came out harder than he'd intended. "The name is on the deed posted in the land office." She gestured toward the table behind her. "I've prepared supper. You should eat while it's hot." He blinked. On the table sat a meal he hadn't cooked: roasted meat, potatoes, what looked like greens from the remains of Eleanor's garden that he'd let go to seed. The smell hit him then, rich and savory, and his stomach clenched with a hunger he'd been ignoring for months. "Lady, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I am offering you a trade." She cut him off with quiet firmness. 3 nights of shelter in exchange for work. I can see what needs doing. The fence by the creek has 3 broken rails. Your rain barrel has a crack that will split completely by winter. The shingles on the east side of the barn are loose. Your garden has gone wild, but the soil is good, and at least a third of what's there can still be salvaged. Garrett lowered the rifle slightly, thrown off balance by the specificity of her observations. You looked at all that in the time it took me to ride home? I have been here since midday. Something flickered in her expression, not quite pride, not quite challenge. I do not waste time, Mr. Rowan. I am asking for shelter, not charity. I will earn my keep. Where did you come from? East. The single word carried the weight of a much longer story. I have been traveling for 11 days. 11 days from where? Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. From circumstances I would prefer not to discuss. The bruise on her face suddenly made more sense. Garrett felt a familiar anger stir, the kind that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with seeing something wrong in the world. He'd felt it before, watching men abuse horses or kick dogs or raise a hand to someone weaker. It was the anger that had gotten him into more than one fight in his younger days, before Eleanor had taught him that sometimes the smarter choice was to walk away. But Eleanor wasn't here anymore. 3 nights, he said finally, lowering the rifle completely. You work, you eat, you sleep in the spare room. After 3 nights, you move on. Agreed. She nodded once, crisp and businesslike. Please, sit, eat. It felt wrong, sitting at his own table while a stranger served him food she'd cooked in his kitchen. But the smell was too good and his resistance too worn down, so Garrett propped the rifle against the wall and dropped into the chair he'd occupied for 15 years. The food was excellent. Better than excellent. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs he hadn't known were still growing in the garden. The potatoes were perfectly roasted, crispy on the outside and soft within. Even the greens, bitter dandelion and wild onion, had been prepared in a way that made them almost sweet. He ate in silence while Maylene moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who knew her way around hard work. She washed the pan she'd used, wiped down the counter, set a pot of coffee on the stove to brew. Every movement was economical, purposeful, wasted on nothing decorative or unnecessary. You know ranch work, Garrett said finally, around a mouthful of potato. My father owned land. Before. She didn't look at him, her attention fixed on measuring coffee grounds into the pot. I learned young. What happened to your father's land? Her shoulders stiffened. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she turned, and the look in her eyes was something cold and controlled. Men with paper and lawyers took it. Men who understood that the law protects whoever has the most money and the least conscience. Garrett recognized that tone. He'd heard it in the voices of ranchers who'd lost everything to bad winters, failed banks, or the railroad cutting deals that served Eastern investors instead of the people who actually worked the land. It was the sound of someone who'd learned that justice and the law weren't always the same thing. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. She acknowledged the sympathy with a slight dip of her head, then poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought them to the table. She sat across from him, her posture straight, her hands wrapped around the cup like she was gathering warmth, even though the evening wasn't particularly cold. Your wife, Maylene said quietly. When did she pass? The question hit harder than it should have. Garrett's hand tightened around his fork. 6 months ago. How did you? There are signs. She gestured around the kitchen. A woman's curtains, but dust on the sills, jars of preserves in the cupboard, arranged by someone who cared about order, but the new harvest vegetables rotting in the garden. A house that was once loved, now left to fade. She wasn't wrong. Garrett could see it himself when he bothered to look. The slow decay of everything Eleanor had built and maintained. The garden she'd tended. The curtains she'd sewn. The little touches of care that had made this place a home instead of just a house. Eleanor, he said, the name still difficult to speak aloud. Her name was Eleanor. She kept a beautiful home. She kept a beautiful everything. Garrett pushed his empty plate away, suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. I haven't been doing a great job maintaining what she left. Grief is heavy work, Maylene said simply. It takes energy you need for other things. The understanding in her voice caught him off guard. This wasn't empty sympathy or awkward condolence. This was recognition from someone who knew the weight firsthand. You've lost someone too, he said. Not a question. My mother, 3 years ago. My father, she paused, choosing her words carefully. My father is alive, but the man he was died the day they took his land. Sometimes that is worse than burial. They sat in silence for a while. The only sound, the gentle hiss of the fire in the stove and the wind beginning to pick up outside. Garrett studied the woman across from him and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. She carried herself like someone used to hard work and harder luck, but there was education in her speech, refinement in the way she held herself. The dress she wore, despite its current state, had been expensive once. Quality fabric, careful stitching. "What's your plan?" he asked finally. "After the 3 nights." "West. There are Chinese communities in California, in San Francisco. I have distant family there. They will help me start again." "That's a long way to travel alone." "I have traveled this far." Her chin lifted slightly, pride showing through the exhaustion. "I will travel the rest." Garrett believed her. Whatever had driven this woman from her home and across 11 days of hard country, it had forged something unbreakable in her. He recognized it because he'd seen it before, in men who'd survived wars and women who'd buried children and anyone who'd stared down the worst the world could offer and refused to quit. "Well," he said, standing and gathering his plate, "you've earned your first night. Spare room is at the end of the hall. Sheets are clean." "Thank you." She rose as well, taking his plate before he could move toward the sink. "I will handle this. You should rest." Part of him wanted to argue, to insist that a man cleaned up after his own meals in his own house. But the larger part was too tired and too grateful for the first decent food he'd eaten in weeks. "Maylene," he said, pausing in the doorway. She looked up, eyebrows raised in question. "That bruise on your face, the man who gave it to you, is he going to come looking for you?" Something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "He will not find me." It wasn't quite an answer, but Garrett decided not to push. If trouble was following this woman, he'd deal with it when it arrived. Montana had taught him that much. Worrying about tomorrow's problems didn't stop them from coming. It just wore you out before they got there. He left her in the kitchen and made his way down the hall to the bedroom he'd once shared with Eleanor. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender soap, a scent he couldn't quite bring himself to wash away. Her hairbrush still sat on the dresser. Her shawl still hung on the back of the door. Garrett undressed mechanically, pulled on the nightshirt that had belonged to his father, and climbed into a bed that felt too large and too empty. Through the wall, he could hear Maylene moving in the spare room, the quiet sounds of someone settling in for the night. For the first time in 6 months, the house didn't feel quite so much like a grave. Morning came cold and clear, the sun breaking over the eastern hills like molten copper. Garrett woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and for one disorienting moment thought Eleanor was in the kitchen, that the past 6 months had been nothing but a cruel dream. Then memory reasserted itself, and he remembered the Chinese woman with the bruised face and the offer of 3 nights' work. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where Maylene had already prepared breakfast: bacon, eggs, and what looked like some kind of fried bread he didn't recognize. "Good morning," she said without turning from the stove. "I hope you don't mind. I found flour and salt in the pantry." "Mind?" "Lady, I haven't had a breakfast I didn't burn in half a year." She cracked something that might have been a smile and set a plate in front of him. The fried bread was crispy and slightly sweet, unlike anything he'd tasted before. He ate it anyway, too hungry to be particular. "What's the plan for today?" he asked between bites. "I thought I would start with the fence by the creek. The broken rails are letting your cattle drift toward the Henderson property. They are old. They will not appreciate the trouble." Garrett paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "How do you know about the Hendersons?" "I walked the property lines yesterday while you were away. The Hendersons have a small operation, maybe 80 head. Their fences are in good repair, but their cattle are thin. Drought year?" 3 years running." Garrett set down his fork and studied her with renewed interest. "You read land the way most people read books." "Land tells better stories than most books," she replied, pouring herself coffee. "And it doesn't lie. Your property could support twice the cattle you're running now if the water management was better. You have a spring-fed creek, but you're not using it efficiently. The cattle are overgrazing the areas close to the existing troughs and ignoring the better pasture to the north because the water is too far away." She was right. Garrett knew she was right because Eleanor had said the same thing 2 years ago, and he'd promised to fix it and then never had. There had always been something more urgent, something more immediate, until Eleanor got sick and everything else stopped mattering. "You've got a good eye," he admitted. "I have a practical eye. There is a difference." She sat across from him, her coffee cup cradled in both hands. "Your land is good, Mr. Rowan, but it is suffering from neglect. That can be fixed if you're willing to do the work." "I'm willing," Garrett said, surprised to find he meant it. "But I don't know if 3 days is enough time to fix 6 months of neglect." "Then we work fast." She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and headed for the door. Garrett followed, grabbing his work gloves from the hook by the entrance. Outside, the morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of sage and pine from the hills. Maylene moved with purpose toward the barn, where she'd apparently already located the tools she needed. She gathered fence rails, a hammer, nails, and a pry bar with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "You don't need to do this," Garrett said as they walked toward the creek. "I can handle the fence work." "I know you can, but I offered to work and I keep my word." They reached the damaged section of fence where 3 rails had split and sagged, leaving a gap large enough for cattle to wander through. Maylene set down her tools and began examining the damage with a critical eye. "This didn't break from age," she said, running her fingers over the splintered wood. "Something hit it, hard." Garrett crouched beside her and saw what she meant. The breaks weren't clean or weathered, they were fresh, violent, the kind of damage that came from impact rather than decay. "Could have been a spooked steer," he offered. "Maybe," but she sounded doubtful. "Or maybe someone wanted your cattle to drift onto Henderson land, create a boundary dispute." "Who would want that?" "Someone who benefits when neighbors fight." She pulled out the damaged rails with efficient strength. "Someone who profits from chaos." It was a disturbing thought, one Garrett didn't particularly want to entertain, but before he could pursue it further, Maylene had already moved on to the repair work, measuring new rails against the old posts and marking where to cut. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of labor taking over. Maylene knew what she was doing. Her cuts were clean, her measurements precise, her hammer strikes confident and sure. Within 2 hours, the fence was repaired and reinforced, stronger than it had been before. "There," she said, stepping back to examine their work. "That will hold." "You're good at this?" Garrett observed. "My father taught me. He said a woman should know how to do everything a man can do, because the world will always try to convince her she cannot." "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. The past tense carried weight. Before they broke him. Garrett wanted to ask more, but something in her expression warned against it. Instead, he gathered the leftover tools and headed back toward the barn. Maylene followed, her eyes already scanning the property for the next problem to solve. She found it quickly enough. "Your rain barrel is worse than I thought," she said, examining the large wooden barrel that stood against the side of the barn. "The crack has spread. It will not last another storm." "I know. I've been meaning to fix it, yes." She cut him off gently. Everyone means to fix things, but meaning and doing are not the same. She was already pulling the barrel away from the wall, examining the damage with the same critical eye she'd turned on everything else. The crack ran nearly a third of the way around the barrel, deep enough that Garrett could see daylight through it. "This needs to be replaced," Maylene said flatly, "but we can patch it temporarily if you have tar and cloth." "I might have some in the shed." They spent the next hour working on the barrel, applying hot tar to the crack and wrapping it tightly with strips of old canvas. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it would hold until Garrett could afford a new barrel or had time to build one. By midday, the sun had climbed high and hot, and Garrett called a break for lunch. They ate cold biscuits and dried beef in the shade of the barn, washing it down with water from the well that tasted of minerals and stone. "Tell me about the land," Maylene said suddenly. "How long have you owned this ranch?" 15 years. Bought it the year after Eleanor and I married. It was rough country then. Most of the fences were down. The house was barely standing. The previous owner had let everything go to hell. But Eleanor saw potential where I just saw work. She was right to see it. She was right about most things. Garrett took another bite of biscuit, chewing slowly. "Took us 5 years to get the place running properly. Another 3 to turn a profit. By the time we had it working the way we wanted, we were too old to have the family we'd planned on." "I'm sorry." "Yeah, well, that's life, isn't it? You make plans and the world makes other arrangements. Maylene smiled faintly at that. Yes, the world is very good at rearranging plans. They finished lunch and got back to work. Maylene turned her attention to the garden, wading into the tangle of weeds and volunteer plants with a focus that bordered on meditation. She worked with her hands, pulling weeds, identifying what could be saved, making mental notes of what needed to be replanted. Garrett watched her for a while from the barn, where he was supposed to be organizing tools, but found himself distracted by the sight of this strange woman bringing order to the chaos Eleanor's death had left behind. There was something almost painful about it, seeing the garden come back to life under Maylene's careful hands. It felt like a betrayal somehow, like he was letting another woman step into Eleanor's place too easily. But it also felt right, necessary, like the land itself was grateful for the attention. He was still wrestling with that contradiction when he heard the horses. Two riders approached from the east, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't in any particular hurry. Garrett recognized them before they were close enough to hail: Tom Henderson and his son Jack, his neighbors, and, if he was being honest, the closest thing he had to friends these days. Tom was in his 60s, weathered and lean, with a white beard that hung halfway down his chest. Jack was 30, solid and quiet, more comfortable with cattle than people. They reined in near the barn, and Tom tipped his hat in greeting. "Garrett," he said. "Afternoon." "Tom, Jack." Garrett moved to meet them, acutely aware of Maylene watching from the garden. "What brings you out?" "Came to check on you, mostly." Tom's eyes drifted to Maylene, curiosity evident. "And to see if you'd heard the news." "What news?" "Conrad Voss bought the Mercer place." Garrett felt something cold settle in his stomach. Mercer was going to sell? Didn't have much choice. Bank was calling his loan and Voss made an offer. Not a good offer, but better than foreclosure. Tom's expression was grim. "That makes 3 ranches Voss has picked up in the last 6 months. Man's building himself an empire." Conrad Voss. The name carried weight in this part of Montana. A land speculator from Denver who'd moved north 2 years ago with money to invest and ambitions that didn't include respecting established boundaries or neighborly custom. He bought cheap, sold high, and didn't much care what methods he used to make it happen. "Mercer's place borders mine on the South Ridge," Garrett said slowly. "Yep." Tom pulled a plug of tobacco from his pocket and bit off a piece. "Borders mine on the west, and with the water situation being what it is, that makes things complicated." "How complicated?" "Complicated enough that I thought you should know. Voss has been making noise about water rights. Says the spring-fed creek that runs through his property, which used to be Mercer's property, gives him first claim on any water that crosses onto neighboring land." Garrett's jaw tightened. "That's not how water rights work." "You know that and I know that. But Voss has lawyers who'll argue otherwise, and lawyers can tie things up in court long enough that a man goes broke fighting." It was a familiar pattern, one Garrett had seen play out across the territory. Men with money and connections using the legal system as a weapon, twisting laws that were meant to protect small operations into tools for crushing them. He glanced back at Maylene, who had stopped working and was listening to the conversation with sharp attention. Her earlier words came back to him. Men with paper and lawyers took it. Men who understood that the law protects whoever has the most money and the least conscience. "I'll keep an eye on it," Garrett said finally. "Thanks for the warning." Tom nodded, his eyes moving to Maylene again. "You going to introduce us to your guest?" Garrett hesitated, then gestured toward the garden. "Maylene, these are my neighbors, Tom and Jack Henderson. Tom, Jack, this is Maylene Zhao. She's helping out with some repairs." Maylene walked over, wiping dirt from her hands on her already stained dress. She met Tom's gaze directly, unflinching. "Mr. Henderson," she said, nodding politely, "your northern fence line needs attention. The wire is loose on the 4th post past the cottonwood tree. It will not hold if your cattle push against it." Tom blinked, clearly taken aback. Then he let out a bark of laughter. "Well, I'll be damned. Woman knows fence work better than most ranch hands I've hired." "I know land," Maylene said simply, "and land does not keep secrets from those who pay attention." Tom studied her with renewed interest, then looked at Garrett with something that might have been approval. "You picked a good helper, Garrett. Wish I could afford someone with her eye." "I'm only here for 3 days?" Maylene said before Garrett could respond. "Then I move west." "Shame. Good help is hard to find. Tom gathered his reins, preparing to leave. Garrett, you come by if you need anything, and keep your ears open about Voss. Man's been buying up land too fast for comfort, and I don't trust his methods. Will do. The Hendersons rode off, and Garrett turned to find Maylin already heading back to the garden. He followed, his mind still chewing on Tom's warning. This Conrad Voss, Maylin said without looking up from her weeding. He is dangerous. He's ambitious. In my experience, that's worse than dangerous. Ambitious men can be stopped. Maybe, but it takes more than good intentions to stop a man with money and lawyers. Maylin pulled a particularly stubborn weed from the soil and tossed it onto the growing pile beside her. Yes, she said quietly. It takes evidence, documentation, proof that cannot be denied. There was something in her tone that made Garrett pause. You sound like you've thought about this before. I have. She sat back on her heels, her eyes distant. When they took my father's land, they did it with forged documents, water rights, exactly like your neighbor described. They claimed the creek that ran through our property was actually on land they had purchased upstream. They had surveys, deeds, official stamps. Everything looked legitimate. But it wasn't. No. But by the time we could prove it was fraudulent, the legal fees had bankrupted my father. The land was sold at auction to pay his debts. The man who bought it— She stopped, her jaw clenching. The man who bought it was the same one who had forged the documents in the first place. Jesus Christ. We had no recourse, no money for appeals, no connections to fight back. Her hands tightened around the weeds she was holding, crushing them. My father gave up. He simply stopped fighting, stopped caring, stopped being the man who had taught me to read land and work hard and never accept injustice. Garrett crouched beside her, seeing the pain that lived beneath her controlled exterior. I'm sorry that happened to you. Sorrow changes nothing. She dropped the crushed weeds and brushed dirt from her palms. But action can. If this Conrad Voss is using the same tactics, he can be stopped the same way, with evidence that proves his claims are false. You think he's running the same scheme? Men like him do not change their methods if the methods work. She stood, brushing dirt from her dress. And if he is buying ranches too quickly, pressuring banks, claiming water rights that are questionable, yes, I think he is running the same scheme. Garrett rose as well, his mind working through the implications. If Voss was operating the way Maylin described, then Tom Henderson wasn't the only one at risk. Every rancher in the territory who relied on creek water or spring access could be vulnerable to the same legal manipulation, including Garrett himself. We should find out for certain, he said slowly, before making accusations. Agreed, but we should also be prepared. Maylin met his eyes with an intensity that made it clear she wasn't just offering advice. She was offering alliance. Men like Voss rely on people being too afraid or too broken to fight back. They count on isolation, on victims not talking to each other, not sharing information. You're suggesting we organize. I am suggesting we gather facts. Talk to the other ranchers Voss has targeted. See if there are patterns. If he is using forged documents, there will be evidence. Repeated notary signatures, similar legal language, timelines that do not make sense. It was a good plan, a smart plan, the kind of plan that required someone who understood how these schemes worked from the inside. You've done this before, Garrett said. Haven't you? Investigated fraud. I tried. After my father's land was stolen, Maylin's expression hardened. I failed. I was too late, and I was alone. But I learned how these men operate. I learned to recognize the patterns. And you think you can stop Voss? I think we can stop him. If we act quickly, and if we work together. Garrett studied the woman standing before him, small and bruised and dressed in a torn traveling dress, but with eyes that burned with purpose and a spine that refused to bend. In that moment, she reminded him of Eleanor, who had faced down drought and disease and heartbreak with the same quiet determination. 3 days isn't enough time, he said. Maylin smiled faintly. Then perhaps we should renegotiate our arrangement. They worked until sunset, repairing fences and clearing the garden and discussing strategies for gathering information about Conrad Voss's land acquisitions. By the time darkness fell, Garrett felt more alive than he had in months, muscles aching from honest labor, mind engaged with a problem that mattered, purpose returning to days that had felt empty for too long. Maylene cooked dinner again, some kind of rice dish with vegetables and dried meat that she somehow made taste extraordinary. They ate at the kitchen table, mapping out which ranchers to approach first, which questions to ask, how to build a case without tipping off Voss that they were investigating him. "We start with the public records," Maylene said, sketching rough notes on a piece of paper. "Land deeds, water rights claims, survey documents. Everything filed with the territorial office is supposed to be available for inspection." Supposed to be? Clerks can be persuaded to lose documents, or to delay access, or to claim records are incomplete. She glanced up from her notes. "We will need to be persistent, and we will need to document everything we find." "You really have done this before." "I really have." She returned to her sketching, adding names and connecting them with lines that showed relationships and timelines. "The pattern will be in the dates. If Voss is forging documents, he will need to backdate them to appear legitimate. That means finding notaries willing to falsify records, or creating false notary stamps. Either way, there will be repetitions. The same handwriting, the same stamps, the same legal language appearing in documents that should have been created by different people at different times. Garrett watched her work, impressed by the methodical precision of her approach. This wasn't anger or revenge driving her planning. This was cold, calculated strategy built on experience and hard-won knowledge. "Tomorrow," she said, "we should ride into town. File a request to review the land records for every property Voss has purchased in the last year. We say we are considering selling, and we want to understand current market patterns." Will they buy that? They will buy anything that sounds like money. Men always do. They finished planning and cleaned up the kitchen together, falling into a rhythm that felt natural despite having known each other less than 2 days. Garrett found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't since Eleanor died, talking freely, laughing occasionally, feeling the weight of grief lift just enough to remember what it was like to be alive instead of just surviving. As Maylene headed toward the spare room for the night, Garrett stopped her with a question that had been building all day. "The man who gave you that bruise," he said carefully. "The one you said wouldn't find you. Was he connected to the people who took your father's land?" Maylene's hand tightened on the doorframe. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she turned, and the look in her eyes was something cold and controlled. "He was my husband," she said quietly. "Or he was, until I left. He worked for the men who destroyed my father. He knew what they were doing, and he helped them do it. And when I confronted him, when I demanded he make it right," she touched the bruise on her cheek lightly. "This was his answer." Garrett felt anger surge hot and immediate. "If he comes here, he will not come here. I made certain of it." Her smile was thin and sharp. "I took documents from his office before I left, papers that prove his involvement in the fraud. If he pursues me, those documents go to the territorial marshal. He knows this. He will let me go rather than risk exposure. You're using his crimes as leverage. I am using his crimes as justice. There is a difference." Garrett nodded slowly, understanding more now about why this woman had walked into his life with such specific knowledge and such fierce determination. She wasn't running from her past. She was preparing to dismantle it. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Yes." Maylene turned toward her room, then paused. "Mr. Rowan?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for letting me stay, for listening, for being willing to fight. Thank you for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for." She smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes and made her look younger, less burdened. Then she disappeared into the spare room, and Garrett was left alone with his thoughts and the quiet sounds of a house that no longer felt quite so empty. He stood in the hallway for a long time, thinking about Eleanor and grief and the strange ways life brought people together. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in 6 months, he slept without dreaming of loss. Tomorrow, they would ride into town and start gathering evidence. Tomorrow, the fight would begin in earnest. But tonight, for just a few hours, there was peace. The ride into town took 3 hours under a sky that couldn't decide between sun and storm. Garrett kept Flint at an easy pace while Maylene rode Eleanor's mare, a dappled gray named Smoke, who hadn't been saddled since the funeral. The horse moved well under Maylene's hands, responsive and calm, as if grateful to be working again. They didn't talk much during the ride. Maylene's eyes stayed busy, scanning the landscape with that same sharp attention she'd turned on everything else. She noted fence lines, water sources, the condition of neighboring ranches they passed. Garrett watched her catalog it all, storing information the way some people collected coins or stamps. The town of Bitter Creek sat in a valley where 3 tributaries converged, creating enough reliable water to support a population of maybe 400 souls when everyone was counted. It had the usual collection of frontier establishments, general store, livery, 2 saloons, a hotel that hadn't seen fresh paint since statehood, and the land office that squatted on Main Street like a toad on a rock. They tied the horses outside the land office and went in together. The interior smelled of dust, paper, and the particular mustiness that came from storing records in a climate that swung between baking heat and freezing cold with no gentle transition between. A clerk sat behind a high desk, a thin man in his 40s with ink-stained fingers and the weary expression of someone who'd stopped caring about his work years ago. He looked up as they entered, his gaze sliding over Garrett with disinterest before stopping on Maylene with something sharper. "Help you?" The question came out flat, uninviting. "We need to review land records," Garrett said, stepping forward to block the clerk's view of Maylene. "All property transactions in the last 18 months involving Conrad Voss." The clerk's expression shifted subtly. "That's a lot of records. Then we'll be here a while." Records review requires a formal request, in writing, with a stated purpose. Garrett had expected this. Men in minor positions of authority loved nothing more than throwing up bureaucratic obstacles. "Fine. I'll write the request. You got paper?" The clerk produced a form with obvious reluctance, sliding it across the desk like he was doing them an enormous favor. Garrett filled it out carefully, stating his purpose as reviewing market patterns for potential property sale. It was thin justification, but technically legitimate. The clerk read it over twice, looking for any excuse to reject it. Finding none, he sighed and disappeared into the back room where the records were kept. He was gone for nearly 20 minutes. When he finally returned, he carried a single ledger book and dropped it on the counter with a heavy thud. "Voss transactions for the past year. You can review them here. No removing documents from the premises. No copying without written authorization." "Understood." Garrett took the ledger to a reading table near the window where the light was better. Maylene followed, pulling up a chair beside him. The ledger contained property transfers, deed recordings, and associated documents filed with the Territorial Land Office. Garrett flipped through the pages, looking for Voss's name in the buyer column. It appeared with disturbing frequency. "Here," Maylene said softly, pointing to an entry dated 4 months earlier. "The Mercer property. Look at the attached water rights claim." Garrett examined the document. It was dense with legal language, but the core claim was clear enough. Voss was asserting primary water rights to the spring-fed creek that ran through the former Mercer Ranch, based on a survey that showed the creek's source originating on his land. "Now look at this one," Maylene said, flipping forward several pages. "The Drucker Ranch, purchased 6 months ago. Same water rights claim. Different creek, but identical legal language." She was right. The documents were nearly word-for-word copies, with only the property descriptions changed. "Could be the same lawyer writing both," Garrett suggested. "Could be. But look at the notary stamps." Garrett leaned closer. Both documents bore notary certifications, complete with official-looking stamps and signatures. The notary's name on the Mercer document was listed as J. Whitmore. The notary on the Drucker document was R. Sullivan, but the stamps themselves were identical, same size, same design, same slightly smudged ink pattern on the territorial seal. "Two different notaries wouldn't have identical stamps," Maylene said quietly. "The stamps are issued individually. Each one has unique characteristics. Unless someone made copies of a legitimate stamp." "Exactly." Her finger traced the smudged section of the seal. "And see this imperfection? It appears on both stamps in the exact same location. That's not coincidence. That's the same physical stamp being used with different names." Garrett felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. This was evidence. Not proof yet, but a clear pattern that suggested fraud. They spent the next 2 hours combing through every Voss transaction in the ledger. The pattern repeated itself across 5 different property acquisitions. The same legal language, the same water rights claims, the same notary stamps appearing under different names. He's been running this scheme for at least a year, Maylene said, making notes on a piece of paper she'd brought. Probably longer. These are just the transactions filed in this county. How many ranchers has he hit? 5 that we can document here, but Tom Henderson mentioned 3 purchases in 6 months, and we're only looking at the public records. There could be private sales that didn't require full recording. Garrett sat back, his mind working through implications. 5 ranches stolen through fraud, 5 families displaced or ruined, and Voss was still operating freely, still buying land, still filing false claims that the territorial system accepted as legitimate. We need more than this, he said finally. We need to prove the notaries don't exist or that they didn't actually certify these documents. We need to find the real notaries, Maylene corrected. The ones whose names and credentials Voss is stealing. If we can get them to testify that they never certified these transactions, the fraud becomes undeniable. That could take weeks, months even. Then we work fast. She gathered her notes and stood. But first we talk to the other ranchers. We need to know if they've noticed the same patterns, if they have documentation, if they're willing to fight back. They returned the ledger to the clerk, who seemed relieved to see them leave. Outside, the sky had made up its mind and settled on gray overcast that promised rain by evening. Garrett untied Flint and was about to mount when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Rowan, what a pleasant surprise!" The voice belonged to Conrad Voss. He stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most ranchers made in a year. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes the color of winter ice. Everything about him spoke of money, confidence, and the kind of power that came from always getting what you wanted. Garrett turned slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "Mr. Voss, I heard you'd come to town. Small communities have efficient communication networks." Voss's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Reviewing land records, I'm told. Thinking of selling?" "Thinking of understanding the market." "Wise, very wise. The market is changing rapidly in this territory. Men who fail to adapt find themselves left behind." Voss's gaze shifted to Maylene, and something cold flickered in his expression. "I don't believe we've been introduced to your companion." "We haven't," Garrett said flatly, offering no further information. Voss waited a moment, expecting elaboration. When none came, his smile tightened fractionally. "Well, if you do decide to sell, I hope you'll give me first opportunity to make an offer. I've been expanding my holdings in this region, and your property borders several parcels I've recently acquired. Consolidation creates efficiency. I'll keep that in mind." "Please do." Voss tipped his hat, the gesture somehow managing to feel like a threat. "Good day, Mr. Rowan, and to you, miss." He walked away, his boots clicking on the boardwalk with metronomic precision. Garrett watched him go, acutely aware of Maylene's tension beside him. "He knows," she said quietly. "Knows what?" "That we were looking at his transactions. The clerk told him. That's why he made a point of being here, of making contact." Garrett considered that. She was probably right. In a small town, information traveled fast, and men like Voss cultivated sources everywhere. The clerk had likely sent word the moment they'd requested Voss's records. "Let him know," Garrett said, mounting Flint. "Might make him nervous. Nervous men make mistakes. Nervous men also escalate." Maylene swung up onto Smoke with practiced ease. "We need to move faster than he can react." They rode out of town at a quicker pace than they'd entered, heading north toward the Henderson Ranch. The sky continued darkening, and the first drops of rain began falling as they crossed onto Henderson land. Tom was in his barn when they arrived, working on a wagon wheel that had lost a spoke. He looked up as they dissembled, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Garrett, Miss Zhao, didn't expect to see you folks today." "We need to talk," Garrett said, "about Conrad Voss and water rights." Tom's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "Come inside. This isn't a conversation for the yard." They followed him into the barn where the smell of hay and leather mixed with the approaching rain. Tom closed the doors behind them, shutting out the weather and prying eyes. "What did you find?" he asked without preamble. Garrett let Maylene answer, She was better at explaining the technical details, the patterns they'd uncovered in the land office records. She spoke clearly and methodically, laying out the evidence. The identical notary stamps, the repeated legal language, the systematic way Voss had been filing fraudulent water rights claims to devalue properties before making low-ball purchase offers. Tom listened in silence, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. When Maylene finished, he let out a long breath. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly. He did the same thing to the Mercer family. Said their water rights were junior to his, that the spring on their property actually originated upstream on land he'd bought. Had documents to prove it, official stamps, the whole works. Mercer couldn't afford to fight it in court, so he sold. "Did you keep any of the documents?" Maylene asked. "Anything Voss filed or gave to Mercer?" Mercer might have. He moved to his daughter's place in Silver City after the sale. I can send word, see if he kept papers. We need everything you can get, and we need to know who else Voss has targeted. Anyone who's been approached with questionable water rights claims, anyone who's had surveys challenged, anyone who's been pressured to sell. Tom scratched his beard, thinking. The Drucker family, for certain. He bought them out 8 months back, and there was talk about the Yates Ranch having boundary disputes, though I don't know if Voss was directly involved. Then there's... He paused, his expression darkening. There's my place. He hasn't made a move yet, but I've been getting visits from surveyors asking permission to check creek sources on my northern section. Don't give them permission, Maylene said sharply. They're not there to survey. They're there to create documentation that will be used against you later. I figured as much. Sent them packing each time. Tom looked at Garrett with something that might have been respect. You're really going after him? A man like Voss? A man like Voss needs to be stopped, Garrett replied. And if we can prove fraud, the territorial courts will have to act. The territorial courts are slow, expensive, and not particularly friendly to small ranchers. Which is why we need evidence so strong they can't ignore it. Maylin's voice carried absolute certainty. We need notaries willing to testify their credentials were stolen. We need the ranchers Voss defrauded to come forward together. We need a federal land examiner willing to review the surveys and prove they're falsified. Tom let out a low whistle. That's a tall order. Yes, but it can be done. Maylene met his eyes directly. I've seen this scheme before. I've watched it destroy families. The only way to stop it is to expose every piece of the fraud publicly in a way that creates legal accountability. And you know how to do that? I learned the hard way. There was a weight in those words that made Tom study Maylene with new attention. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him because he nodded slowly. All right, I'm in. I'll reach out to Mercer and I'll talk to the other ranchers who've been pushed by Voss. But Garrett, you need to understand, this is going to get ugly. Voss has money and connections. He's not going to take this lying down. I'm counting on it, Garrett said. A man who fights back is a man who reveals himself. Right now, Voss operates in shadows, using paperwork and legal manipulation. If we force him into the open, make him defend himself publicly, he'll make mistakes. Or he'll crush you. Maybe, but I'd rather go down fighting than watch him steal everything I've built. Tom extended his hand and Garrett shook it. The grip was firm, calloused, the handshake of a man who understood what they were committing to. I'll get you names and any documents I can find, Tom said. Give me 3 days. We'll take 2, Maylene said. Voss knows we were reviewing his records. He'll move fast to cover his tracks or discredit us. We need to move faster. The rain had intensified by the time they left the Henderson Ranch, coming down in sheets that turned the dirt roads to mud and reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. They rode hard anyway, pushing through the weather toward home. By the time they reached Garrett's ranch, both of them were soaked through and shivering. They took care of the horses first, unsaddling, rubbing down, making sure Flint and Smoke were dry and fed before seeing to their own comfort. Inside the house, Maylin immediately started a fire in the stove while Garrett changed into dry clothes. When he returned to the kitchen, she'd already put coffee on and was standing close to the stove, trying to warm herself. You should change, Garrett said, grabbing a blanket from the back of the couch. I'll get the fire going in the main room. Maylene disappeared into the spare room and returned a few minutes later wearing the only other dress she owned, A simple blue cotton that was in better condition than the torn traveling dress but still showed signs of hard use. Her hair hung loose and damp around her shoulders, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked young and vulnerable instead of fierce and determined. They sat by the fire with their coffee, watching flames dance behind the grate. The storm battered the windows, wind howling around the corners of the house like something wild trying to get in. "Tell me about your father," Garrett said quietly. "What was he like before they broke him?" Maylene was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. "He was brilliant, strong. He saw possibilities where others saw only obstacles." She smiled faintly at the memory. When he came to Montana, he had nothing, just determination and a knowledge of water management that he'd learned in China. He found land near a creek that everyone said was useless, too rocky to farm, too isolated to ranch properly. But my father understood water. He built irrigation channels, terraces, systems that turned worthless land into something productive. Sounds like a remarkable man. He was. He taught me everything: how to read land, how to manage resources, how to plan for seasons and weather patterns. He said that in America, a woman could be anything she was smart enough and strong enough to become. He believed that. What changed? Maylene's expression hardened. Men who saw what he'd built and decided they wanted it for themselves. They couldn't buy it honestly. My father wouldn't sell. So they manufactured a legal dispute. Forged surveys showing that our primary water source actually originated on neighboring property they'd purchased. Filed claims that made our water rights junior to theirs. By the time my father realized what was happening, they'd tied him up in legal proceedings he couldn't afford to fight. "And your husband was part of it?" "Yes." The single word carried bitter weight. "I didn't know, not at first. He worked for a land company in Denver. I thought he was legitimate. By the time I understood what he really did, what he helped other men do, we were already married, and my father's land was already lost." "You confronted him." "I demanded he make it right. Use his position to expose the fraud, return what they'd stolen." She touched the fading bruise on her cheek. "He made his priorities clear." Garrett felt the familiar anger rise again, the kind that came from seeing injustice done to people who didn't deserve it. "He's a coward. He's a predator. There's a difference. Cowards run from fights. Predators choose victims they think can't fight back." Maylene's eyes met his, sharp and clear. "That's why stopping Voss matters. Men like him count on people being too afraid, too broken, too isolated to resist. They win by making their victims feel helpless." "You don't seem helpless." "I'm not. Not anymore. I was for a while after my father gave up. I felt powerless, trapped in a marriage to a man who'd helped destroy my family. But powerlessness is a choice. Staying helpless is a choice. I chose differently." "You walked away." "I took what I needed to protect myself and I walked away. And now I'm using what I learned to make sure other families don't suffer the same way mine did." Thunder rolled across the valley, close enough to rattle the windows. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows across the walls. Garrett studied the woman sitting across from him and felt something shift in his chest, some old locked door opening just enough to let in light. "You're staying," he said. Not a question. Maylene raised her eyebrows. "Our agreement was 3 nights." "Our agreement can be renegotiated. You said so yourself." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You've got unfinished business with men like Voss. I've got a ranch that needs defending. Seems like we could help each other. You want me to stay to fight Voss? I want you to stay because you're good at this. You see patterns I miss. You understand fraud in ways I never could. And because—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Because having you here reminds me what it feels like to have purpose beyond just surviving each day." Maylene was quiet for a long time, her dark eyes reflecting firelight. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "If I stay, it won't be temporary. The fight against Voss could take months, and even when he's stopped, there will be others like him. There always are." "I know. And I will not be a replacement for your wife. I can't be Eleanor, and I won't try." I'm not asking you to be. Eleanor was—" His voice caught. "Eleanor was the love of my life, but she's gone. And I can't spend the rest of my days living in a memorial to what I lost. I need to build something new, something that honors what we had but doesn't try to recreate it. And you think I can help you do that? I think we can help each other do that. You need a base of operations to fight men like Voss. I need a reason to keep fighting instead of just letting everything slide into ruin. Seems like we both win." Maylene smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, warming her expression in ways that made her truly beautiful. "All right, Mr. Rowan, I'll stay. We'll fight Voss together, and we'll see what else we can build." They shook hands on it, formal and businesslike, sealing an arrangement that felt like it meant more than either of them was quite ready to say out loud. The storm continued into the night, battering the ranch with wind and rain that tested every board and shingle. But inside, the house felt solid and warm, occupied by two people who'd found in each other something they hadn't known they needed: purpose, partnership, and the beginning of a fight that would change everything. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having scrubbed the sky clean. Garrett woke early and found Maylene already in the kitchen, working through papers she'd brought from town. "I've been thinking about the notaries," she said without preamble. "If Voss is using stolen credentials, the real notaries are probably located in different counties. He wouldn't risk using local people who might discover the fraud." "Makes sense. Harder to verify credentials from a distance." "Exactly. So we need to send inquiries to the Territorial Notary Registration Office. Request verification of the notaries listed on Voss's documents. If they don't exist, or if they're located hundreds of miles away and never certified these transactions, we have proof." "How long will that take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on how backed up the registration office is. But we can't wait that long. We need to keep pressure on Voss now, while he's still reacting to our land office visit. Garrett poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "What do you suggest?" "We talk to the Drucker family. Find out exactly what Voss told them, what documents he provided, how he pressured them to sell. If we can get them to go on record about the fraud, it adds weight to everything else we're building. They might not want to relive it. They might not have a choice. If Voss is using the same scheme on other ranches, the Drucker's testimony could prevent more families from being destroyed." Maylene's expression was sympathetic but firm. Sometimes justice requires reopening old wounds. She was right, and Garrett knew it, but that didn't make the prospect of asking the Drucker family to dredge up painful memories any easier. They spent the morning preparing, writing out questions, organizing the documentation they'd gathered, planning their approach. By noon, they were riding east toward the Drucker homestead, a modest operation that sat in the shadow of the Big Belt Mountains. What they found there stopped them both cold. The ranch house stood empty, windows dark, the yard overgrown with weeds. The barn doors hung open, revealing an interior stripped of tools and equipment. Everything that could be moved had been taken. Everything that remained showed signs of neglect and abandonment. Garrett dismounted slowly, his chest tight with a familiar ache. He'd seen this before, the aftermath of families broken by circumstance, forced to walk away from everything they'd built. "They're gone," he said unnecessarily. Maylene was already checking the property, her sharp eyes cataloging details. She knelt by the front porch and picked up a piece of paper that had been weighted down with a rock. "Foreclosure notice," she said, reading quickly, "dated 3 weeks ago. The bank seized the property for unpaid debts." "I thought Voss bought them out." "He did, but look at the timeline." She handed him the notice. "Voss purchased the ranch 8 months ago. This foreclosure is recent, which means Voss didn't pay off their debts the way he promised. He let the bank take the property, probably bought it again at the foreclosure auction for even less than his original offer. It was a vicious cycle. Buy a ranch at a depressed price by manufacturing a crisis, promise to resolve the owner's debts, then renege and let the bank finish the job. Voss got the land twice, paying less each time, while the original owners were left with nothing. "Where did they go?" Garrett asked. "East, probably. Back to family if they had any, or to a city where they could start over." Maylene folded the foreclosure notice carefully. "Either way, they're gone. We won't be getting testimony from them." It was a setback, but not a fatal one. They still had patterns, documentation, Tom Henderson's promise to gather other ranchers who'd been targeted. But it underscored how ruthless Voss was, how little he cared about the lives he destroyed in pursuit of profit. They were preparing to leave when Garrett noticed smoke rising from the neighboring property, about a mile east through a stand of pine trees. "Someone's over there," he said, pointing. The Yates Ranch, Maylene said, consulting the mental map she seemed to carry of every property in the territory. Tom Henderson mentioned they'd had boundary disputes. They rode toward the smoke and found a small homestead nestled in a valley, well-maintained and clearly occupied. A woman was working in the yard, hanging laundry on a line strung between two trees. She looked up as they approached, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle leaning against the porch railing. "Easy," Garrett called, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "We're neighbors. Garrett Rowan, from the ranch north of Bitter Creek. This is Maylin Zhao." The woman relaxed fractionally, but didn't move away from the rifle. She was perhaps 40, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much hardship to trust easily. "Sarah Yates," she said. "What brings you out here?" "We're investigating Conrad Voss," Maylene said directly. "We have reason to believe he's been running a fraud scheme involving water rights and land purchases. Tom Henderson mentioned you'd had boundary disputes." Sarah's expression shifted from wariness to something harder. "Voss? That bastard's been trying to steal my land for 6 months." "Tell us," Garrett said. Sarah glanced toward the house, where a young boy, maybe 10 years old, had appeared in the doorway. "Daniel, go inside, check on your sister." The boy hesitated, then obeyed. Once he was gone, Sarah turned back to Garrett and Maylene, her jaw set. "My husband died 2 years ago. Logging accident, left me with 2 children and a ranch I barely know how to run. I've been managing, but it's hard." She crossed her arms defensively. 3 months after James died, Voss showed up. Said he was sorry for my loss, said he knew I was struggling, said he wanted to help. Made an offer to buy the place. Fair price, or so he claimed. "You refused," Maylene said. "Damn right I refused. This land is my children's inheritance. It's all they have left of their father. I'm not selling it to some vulture who smells opportunity in a widow's grief." "So Voss changed tactics." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Changed tactics. That's putting it mildly. First it was concerns about my water rights. Then it was surveyors showing up uninvited claiming they had legal authority to assess creek boundaries. Then it was letters from lawyers saying my water usage was illegal, that I was stealing from water sources that originated on Voss's property upstream. Did you fight it?" "I tried. Hired a lawyer in Helena, spent money I couldn't afford on legal advice. The lawyer said Voss's claims were questionable, but that fighting them in court would cost more than the ranch is worth." Her hands clenched into fists. "I'm trapped. Can't afford to fight, can't afford to give up. So I'm just waiting for Voss to make his next move, waiting for the bank to lose patience with my debt, waiting for everything to fall apart." Maylene stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not trapped, and you're not alone. We're gathering evidence that Voss has been running the same scheme on multiple ranchers. Forged documents, false water rights claims, manufactured legal crises. If we can prove it, we can stop him." Sarah's eyes narrowed with something that might have been hope. "You really think you can beat him?" "I think we can expose him. And exposure is the same as defeat for men like Voss. Their power comes from operating in shadows, using legal complexity to intimidate people who can't afford to fight back. If we drag everything into the light, prove the fraud publicly, he loses. What do you need from me?" "Documentation. Everything Voss has sent you, letters, legal notices, survey reports, water rights claims. And your testimony when the time comes. We need ranchers willing to stand together and say publicly that Voss defrauded them." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. Then she nodded sharply. "All right, I'm in. I'll give you everything I have, and I'll testify. But I need a promise." "What promise?" Garrett asked. "That if this goes wrong, if Voss comes after me harder, you'll help me protect my children. I don't care what happens to me, but Daniel and Emma are not losing their home because I chose to fight." "You have my word," Garrett said. "If Voss escalates, we stand together, all of us." Sarah extended her hand and they shook on it, another alliance forged, another piece of the resistance falling into place. She invited them inside and spent the next hour pulling documents from a wooden box she kept hidden under her bed. Letters from Voss's lawyers, survey reports with questionable findings, water rights claims filed with the territorial office. Every piece of paper was another thread in the pattern of fraud. Maylin reviewed each document carefully, making notes, comparing language and signatures. This is excellent, she said finally. The legal language matches what we found in the land office. And look, the notary on this water rights claim is listed as M. Brennan, but the stamp is identical to the ones we saw in the Mercer and Drucker documents. Same stamp, different name, Garrett said, which means either the notaries are all using the same forged stamp, or someone is stealing multiple notary credentials and using a single fake stamp for all of them. Mei Lin's smile was sharp. Either way, it's fraud. Provable fraud. They left the Yates Ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, their saddlebags heavy with documentation. Sarah stood on her porch and watched them go, her children beside her, and Garrett felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They were building something now, not just gathering evidence, but constructing a coalition of people who'd been hurt by Voss and were ready to fight back. It was powerful and fragile at the same time, powerful because it represented collective action, fragile because it only took one person breaking under pressure to bring everything down. "We're going to win this," Mei Lin said as they rode through the gathering dusk. "I can feel it." Garrett wanted to believe her, but he'd lived long enough to know that feeling something and making it real were two very different things. Still, as they crested the ridge and saw his ranch spread out below, lamplight already glowing in the kitchen window because Mei Lin had thought to leave it burning before they left, he felt something close to hope stirring in his chest. They had evidence. They had allies. They'd had a plan. Now they just had to execute it before Voss realized how much danger he was actually in. The response from the Territorial Notary Registration Office arrived 6 days later, delivered by a postal rider who looked like he'd ridden through hell to get there. Garrett signed for the envelope while Mei Lin hovered at his shoulder, her tension palpable. He waited until they were inside before breaking the seal. The letter was brief and devastating in its clarity. Of the 5 notary names appearing on Voss's water rights documents, 3 didn't exist in the territorial registry. The other 2 were real notaries, one located in Butte, nearly 200 miles north, the other in Cheyenne, across the border in Wyoming. Neither had any record of certifying documents related to properties in the Bitter Creek region. "We have him," Mei Lin said quietly, reading over Garrett's shoulder. "This is proof. Concrete, undeniable proof of fraud." Garrett set the letter on the table, his mind already moving ahead to what came next. "Proof isn't enough. We need someone with authority to act on it." "A federal land examiner," Mei Lin said, the same thing she'd been saying for days. "Someone outside Voss's sphere of influence who can review the evidence and bring charges." "The nearest federal land office is in Helena. That's a 4-day ride minimum." "Then we ride to Helena." Garrett looked at her, seeing the fierce determination in her eyes, and felt something between admiration and concern. She was ready to chase this fight to the ends of the earth if necessary, but rushing headlong into Helena without a plan could backfire in ways they couldn't afford. "We need more than just this letter," he said carefully. "We need the ranchers Voss defrauded willing to testify. We need the forged documents themselves, not just copies. We need a case so airtight that a federal examiner has no choice but to investigate. Then we gather it all. Now. Today." Mei Lin was already moving, pulling on her coat. "Tom Henderson said he'd have information from the other ranchers. Sarah Yates gave us her documents. We collect everything, we organize it, and then we ride to Helena with a case that can't be ignored." She was right, but Garrett could feel time pressing against them like a physical weight. Every day they delayed was another day Voss could use to cover his tracks, intimidate witnesses, or consolidate his hold on the territory. "I'll ride to Tom's place," Garrett said, making the decision. "You organize what we have here, create a timeline, match the forged documents to the notary letter, build the narrative we'll present to the federal examiner." Mei Lin nodded, already pulling papers from the box where they'd been storing evidence. "Go. I'll have everything ready by the time you return." Garrett saddled Flint and rode hard toward the Henderson ranch, pushing the gelding faster than he should have, but unable to shake the feeling that they were racing against a clock that had already started counting down. Tom was waiting for him, which meant someone had seen Garrett coming and sent word ahead. The old rancher stood in his yard with his son Jack beside him, and the expressions on both their faces told Garrett something had changed. "What happened?" Garrett asked, dismounting. "Voss made his move," Tom said grimly. "Filed a formal water rights claim with the territorial court yesterday. Says the spring that feeds my northern pasture actually originates on his property. He's demanding I cease all water usage pending a hearing." "Can he do that?" He can file whatever he wants. Whether it holds up in court is another matter, but the filing itself creates problems. My cattle need water. I can't just shut down access while lawyers argue about property lines that were settled 20 years ago. Garrett felt anger surge hot and immediate. This was exactly what Maylene had warned about. Voss escalating, moving fast to destabilize his opponents before they could organize a defense. We have proof he's using forged notary credentials, Garrett said, pulling the letter from the territorial registry out of his coat. This came today. 3 of the notaries on his documents don't exist. The other 2 never certified any transactions in this region. Tom read the letter twice, his expression hardening with each pass. This is it, then. This is what we need to stop him. It's part of what we need, but we need to move fast. Voss is accelerating his timeline because he knows we're investigating. We need to get this to a federal land examiner before he can do more damage. Helena? Helena. But first, I need everything you've gathered from the other ranchers. Every document, every testimony, every piece of evidence that shows a pattern of fraud. Tom disappeared into his house and returned with a leather satchel stuffed with papers. Talked to 7 families over the past week. 5 of them were willing to provide documentation. 2 were too scared of reprisal. Can't say I blame them. Voss has a reputation for making life difficult for people who cross him. Garrett took the satchel, feeling the weight of other people's pain and lost homes pressing against his hands. The 5 who came forward, will they testify? If you can guarantee protection from retaliation, yes. These are folks who've lost everything or are about to lose everything. They're angry and they're tired of being pushed around, but they're also scared, and they need to know that standing up won't just make things worse. I can't guarantee anything, Garrett said honestly, but I can promise we'll fight together. That has to count for something. Tom gripped his shoulder hard. It counts for plenty. You let me know when you're ready to ride to Helena. I'm coming with you. You've got a ranch to run. Jack can handle the ranch for a few days. This is more important. Tom's jaw set with stubborn determination. Voss filed against me directly. I've got standing to bring charges, and I've got documentation to support them. The federal examiner will want to hear from someone who's an active target, not just collecting evidence on behalf of others. He was right, and Garrett knew it. Having Tom's direct testimony would strengthen their case considerably. We leave at dawn tomorrow, Garrett said. Pack for a week. This might take time once we get there. He rode back to his ranch with the satchel of documents strapped behind his saddle, his mind churning through logistics and strategy. They had proof now. They had witnesses. They had a target in Helena who could act on the evidence. What they didn't have was certainty that any of it would be enough. Maylene had transformed the kitchen into a war room by the time he returned. Papers covered every surface, organized into neat stacks with handwritten labels. A large sheet of butcher paper hung on the wall, covered with a timeline showing every Voss property acquisition, every forged document, every victim. This is incredible, Garrett said, surveying her work. This is necessary. Maylene didn't look up from the document she was annotating. A federal land examiner won't have time to sort through chaos. We need to present the evidence in a way that tells the story clearly, showing pattern, intent, and systematic fraud. She'd done exactly that. The timeline showed Voss's operation with brutal clarity, acquisitions clustered around water sources, forged notary documents filed within weeks of purchase offers, families displaced following manufactured legal crises. It was a map of predation drawn in ink and documentation. Tom's coming with us to Helena, Garrett said, adding the new satchel of documents to the table. He was filed against yesterday. Voss is claiming water rights to the spring on Tom's northern section. Maylene's head snapped up. Yesterday? That's faster than I expected. He's feeling pressure. He knows we're building a case. Then he'll move even faster. She stood, her expression shifting from focused to urgent. We need to leave tonight, not tomorrow. Every hour we wait is another hour Voss can use to intimidate witnesses or forge new documents or bribe officials. We can't ride to Helena in the dark. The mountain passes are too dangerous. Then we ride as far as we can tonight and finish the journey at dawn. But we need to move, Garrett. Now. The urgency in her voice convinced him. They spent the next hour packing. Supplies, camping gear, weapons, and most importantly, the carefully organized evidence that represented weeks of investigation and the testimony of families who'd been destroyed by Voss's greed. Tom and Jack arrived just after sunset, leading pack horses loaded with their own supplies. Tom had the hard, set expression of a man who'd made peace with a difficult decision and was ready to see it through. "Jack's staying to watch both properties," Tom said. "Voss might try something while we're gone. Better to have someone keeping eyes on things." They rode out under a sky turning purple with twilight, pushing north toward the mountain passes that would take them to Helena. The journey would cover nearly 80 miles of hard country, through forests thick with pine and valleys that still held snow in their shadowed depths. They rode in silence for the first hour, each person alone with their thoughts. Garrett found his mind drifting to Eleanor, wondering what she would think of all this. Her grieving husband partnering with a Chinese woman to take down a land speculator through federal legal channels. Eleanor had always believed in fighting for what was right, but she'd also been practical, careful, not given to rushing headlong into battles that might be unwinnable. But then again, Eleanor had never been the type to watch injustice happen without acting. She would have approved of Maylin, Garrett thought, would have recognized the same stubborn determination, the same refusal to accept that the world couldn't be changed. They made camp at midnight in a clearing beside a creek that ran fast and cold with snowmelt. Tom built a fire while Maylin tended the horses, and Garrett unpacked supplies. They ate cold biscuits and dried meat, washing it down with creek water that tasted of stone and distance. "Tell me about this federal examiner," Tom said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What makes you think he'll help us?" "His name is Elias Granger," Maylin said. "I've researched him. Former surveyor, current federal land examiner based in Helena. He's built a reputation for being thorough, honest, and willing to challenge fraudulent claims regardless of who's making them." Reputation and reality aren't always the same thing. "No, but everything I've found suggests Granger is the rare official who actually believes in the purpose of his office, protecting legitimate land claims and exposing fraud. He's testified in 3 major cases in the past 5 years, all of them resulting in convictions." Tom grunted, seeming satisfied. "Let's hope he lives up to his reputation, because if we ride all the way to Helena and he turns us away, we've wasted time we can't afford to lose." "He won't turn us away," Maylin said with absolute certainty. "The evidence is too strong, and Granger's not the type to ignore systematic fraud just because it's inconvenient." Garrett hoped she was right. They were betting everything on Granger's integrity and willingness to act. If that bet failed, they'd return to Bitter Creek with nothing but wasted time, and Voss would be free to continue his operation unchecked. They broke camp at first light and rode hard through terrain that climbed steadily toward the mountains. The morning was clear and cold, breath steaming from the horses' nostrils as they navigated narrow trails that wound between stands of lodgepole pine. By noon, they'd cleared the first major pass and were descending into a valley where a small settlement marked the halfway point to Helena. They stopped only long enough to water the horses and buy fresh supplies from a trading post run by a man who asked no questions and offered no conversation beyond what was necessary for commerce. Back on the trail, the afternoon stretched long and hard. The mountains gave way to rolling hills covered in sage and bunch grass, and the temperature climbed as they descended from elevation. Garrett's back ached from hours in the saddle, and he could see similar exhaustion in Tom's weathered face. But Maylin rode like she was being chased, her posture straight, her attention fixed on the trail ahead. Whatever physical discomfort she felt, she refused to let it slow her down. They made camp again that night in a draw sheltered from the wind, and this time they allowed themselves a proper fire and hot food. Tom proved surprisingly skilled at camp cooking, producing a stew from dried vegetables and salt pork that tasted far better than it had any right to. "You've done this before," Garrett observed, watching Tom work. "Spent 3 years prospecting in the Bitterroots before I settled into ranching. Man learns to cook or he starves." Tom stirred the pot with economical efficiency. "Also learned that a hot meal at the end of a hard day does more for morale than just about anything else." They ate in weary contentment, the fire crackling and the stars emerging overhead in vast scattered profusion. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, and the horses shifted nervously in their picket line. "What happens if we win?" Tom asked suddenly. "If Granger takes the case and Voss gets charged with fraud, what happens to the land he stole?" "Legally, the fraudulent sales would be voided," Maylin said. The properties would revert to their original owners or their heirs, assuming they can be located and their claims verified. And if the original owners are gone, scattered to other territories or dead, then it becomes complicated. The territorial court would have to sort through competing claims, determine who has legitimate standing. It could take years. Tom nodded slowly, his expression distant. So even if we win, justice might not look the way we want it to. Justice rarely does, Maylene said quietly. But exposing fraud and stopping further harm is still worth doing, even if we can't perfectly restore what was lost. They finished eating and settled into their bedrolls, taking turns on watch through the night. When Garrett's shift came in the small hours before dawn, he sat by the dying fire and thought about justice and restoration and the messy, complicated work of trying to make things right in a world that seemed designed to resist it. Helena appeared on the horizon late the following afternoon, a sprawl of buildings nestled in a valley where Last Chance Gulch had once drawn prospectors by the thousands. The gold rush days had faded, but Helena had survived as the territorial capital, home to government offices and the kind of bureaucracy that came with official status. They found lodging at a modest hotel and spent an hour cleaning trail dust from themselves and their clothes. Garrett shaved for the first time in 3 days and changed into the one good shirt he'd packed. Maylene appeared in a dark dress that managed to look both practical and formal, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence of her features. Tom wore his cleanest work shirt and a vest that had seen better days but still carried itself with dignity. He looked like exactly what he was, a hard-working rancher who'd been pushed too far and had come to demand accountability. The federal land office occupied a stone building on the main street, solid and imposing in the way of structures built to last. They climbed the steps together, Garrett carrying the satchel of evidence, Maylene with her organized timeline and documentation, Tom with his filed water rights claim from Voss. Inside, a clerk directed them to the second floor where Elias Granger maintained his office. They found his door marked with a simple brass plate and knocked. "Enter," came a voice from within. Elias Granger was in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of a man who'd spent significant time in the field rather than behind a desk. He looked up from the survey map he'd been studying and gestured toward the chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Help you folks?" "Mr. Granger, my name is Garrett Rowan. This is Maylin Zhao and Tom Henderson. We've come from Bitter Creek with evidence of systematic land fraud involving forged documents and false water rights claims." Granger's expression shifted from polite interest to sharp attention. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "That's a serious accusation. You have documentation?" Garrett set the satchel on the desk. Maylin spread out the timeline, the forged documents, the letter from the territorial notary registry. Tom added his own filed claim from Voss, showing the most recent escalation. Granger studied it all in silence, his eyes moving methodically from document to document, his fingers tracing the timeline Maylene had created. The office was quiet, except for the rustle of paper and the distant sounds of the street below. After what felt like an hour but was probably 15 minutes, Granger sat back and fixed them with a steady gaze. "This is damning evidence," he said flatly. "The notary fraud alone is prosecutable. Combined with the pattern of acquisitions and the testimony from displaced families, this represents systematic criminal activity on a significant scale." "Can you stop it?" Tom asked. "I can investigate. I can bring this to the territorial prosecutor. I can testify in court if charges are filed." Granger's expression was serious. "But you need to understand, Conrad Voss is a wealthy man with connections. He'll fight this with every resource he has. Legal challenges, delays, attempts to discredit your evidence and your witnesses. This won't be clean or quick." "We understand," Maylene said, "but systematic fraud doesn't stop unless someone forces it into the light. Will you help us do that?" Granger studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I will. But we need to move carefully. If Voss gets wind that a federal investigation is underway, he'll start covering his tracks, destroying documents, intimidating witnesses, potentially fleeing the territory altogether." "What do you suggest?" Garrett asked. "I'll file an official investigation request tomorrow morning that gives us legal authority to compel document production and witness testimony. Meanwhile, you folks need to get back to Bitter Creek and keep Voss from realizing how much trouble he's in." "How do we do that?" "Act normal. Continue your regular routines. Don't confront him directly. Don't tip your hand. Granger pulled a form from his desk drawer and began filling it out with swift, precise handwriting. I'll need sworn statements from each of you detailing what you've observed and what evidence you've collected. Those statements become part of the official record and give us foundation for broader investigation. They spent the next 3 hours providing detailed testimony, walking Granger through every piece of evidence, every conversation, every pattern they'd uncovered. Maylene's encyclopedic memory proved invaluable. She recalled specific dates, exact wording from documents, details that Garrett had noticed but hadn't cataloged with her precision. By the time they finished, the sun had set and the street lamps were being lit outside. Granger organized everything they'd provided into a file that looked official and substantial, the kind of documentation that carried weight in courtrooms and government offices. I'll ride out to Bitter Creek in 1 week, he said, handing each of them a copy of their sworn statements. That gives me time to file the investigation, gather additional resources, and prepare for field work. When I arrive, I'll need access to the actual properties in question, surveys, water sources, boundary markers. Can you arrange that? We can, Tom said. Most of the ranchers affected will cooperate. The ones too scared to testify might still allow property access if it's for an official investigation. Good, because the strongest evidence will come from showing that Voss's surveys are falsified, that the water sources he claims originate on his property actually originate elsewhere, that his boundary claims don't match the physical reality. They left the federal building as full darkness settled over Helena, carrying with them copies of the sworn statements and a fragile sense that maybe, just maybe, they'd started something that couldn't be stopped. He believed us, Tom said quietly as they walked back toward the hotel. Granger actually believed us. He believed the evidence, Maylene corrected. The notary fraud is undeniable. Everything else just makes the case stronger. They ate dinner at a restaurant Tom knew from previous trips to Helena, a modest establishment that served decent food without charging territorial capital prices. The mood was cautiously optimistic, tempered by the knowledge that the hardest work still lay ahead. 1 week, Garrett said, pushing food around his plate. That's not much time to prepare the other ranchers. Make sure everyone's ready for Granger's arrival. It's enough, Maylene said. We have a list of everyone affected. We know which properties need to be accessed. We just need to coordinate and make sure Voss doesn't suspect what's coming. He already suspects something, Tom pointed out. He filed against me the day after you visited the land office. Man's not stupid. Well, no, but he's arrogant. He thinks his money and connections make him untouchable. He won't expect a federal investigation until it's already underway. Maylene's smile was sharp. By the time he realizes the danger, it'll be too late to cover his tracks. They rode out of Helena the next morning, pushing hard to make up time. The journey back to Bitter Creek took 2.5 days of relentless travel, stopping only when absolutely necessary, pushing both horses and themselves to the edge of exhaustion. They arrived home under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, the horses lathered and breathing hard. Jack Henderson met them at Tom's ranch with news that made Garrett's blood run cold. Voss showed up yesterday, Jack said, his young face tight with anger. Came to the property with 2 men, said he was exercising his right to inspect the disputed water source. I couldn't stop him legally. He had papers saying the territorial court had granted him access pending the hearing. What did he do? Tom demanded. Walked the northern section, took measurements, made notes. The 2 men with him looked like hired muscle, not surveyors. Jack's jaw clenched. He was sending a message, Pa, showing he can come and go as he pleases. Tom's face had gone hard as granite. He's escalating, trying to intimidate us before Granger arrives. Then we hold steady, Maylene said firmly. We don't react. We don't confront. We let Voss think he's won, right up until Granger rides in with federal authority and tears his operation apart. Garrett nodded, though every instinct screamed to ride to Voss's ranch and make the confrontation direct and physical. But that would be playing Voss's game, giving him ammunition to claim harassment or violence, muddying the legal waters they'd worked so hard to keep clear. 1 week, he said, repeating Granger's timeline like a mantra. We hold for 1 week, and then everything changes. They separated. Tom and Jack returning to their ranch, Garrett and Maylene riding the final miles to Garrett's property. The sky had made good on its threat by the time they arrived, rain falling in steady sheets that turned the yard to mud, and drummed against the roof with relentless insistence. Inside, the house felt cold and dark, despite being unchanged from when they'd left. Maylene built a fire while Garrett tended the horses, and by the time he came back inside, she'd transformed the kitchen into something warm and welcoming. "We did it," she said, pouring coffee with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. "We got Granger's commitment. We set the investigation in motion." "We started it," Garrett corrected. "Finishing it is going to be harder." "I know." She sat across from him, her face showing the weariness of days in the saddle and nights with too little sleep. "But we took the first step. That's what matters. We stopped being victims and became fighters." Garrett studied her across the table. This woman who'd walked into his life with nothing but bruises and determination, who'd reminded him what it meant to have purpose beyond grief, who'd shown him that sometimes the right fight was worth the risk of losing everything. "Thank you," he said quietly. Maylene raised her eyebrows. "For what?" "For not giving up. On this fight, on these people, on me." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, feeling its warmth. Eleanor used to say that the world divided into people who gave up when things got hard and people who dug in deeper. You're the second kind. "So are you," Maylene said. "You just forgot for a while." "Grief has a way of making us forget who we are." "And what happens after?" Garrett asked. "After Voss is stopped, after the investigation concludes. What then?" Maylene was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting firelight. "Then we build something worth keeping, a ranch that thrives, a community that protects its own, a life that honors the past without being trapped by it." It was the closest she'd come to talking about a shared future, about something beyond the immediate fight. Garrett felt something unfold in his chest, some long-closed door opening to let in light. "I'd like that," he said. "So would I." The rain continued through the night, washing away the dust of their journey and leaving everything clean and new. They sat by the fire and planned for Granger's arrival, organizing the ranchers who would need to provide property access, preparing responses to whatever legal challenges Voss might throw at them. But beneath the planning and preparation, something else was building. A partnership that had started as pragmatic necessity and was becoming something deeper, more permanent, more like the foundation of a life built together rather than just survived in parallel. 1 week. 7 days until Granger arrived and the final confrontation began. 7 days to prepare, to shore up their defenses, to make sure that when the moment came, they were ready for whatever Voss threw at them. Outside, the rain fell steady and clean, washing the world in preparation for what was coming. Granger arrived exactly 1 week later, riding into Bitter Creek at midday with 2 assistants and a wagon loaded with surveying equipment. Word spread through town within minutes. A federal land examiner had come, and everyone knew what that meant. Garrett and Maylene met him at the hotel, where Granger had taken rooms for his team. The examiner looked road-weary but focused, his eyes carrying the sharp intensity of a man on official business. "The territorial prosecutor has approved the investigation," Granger said without preamble, spreading documents across the hotel room's small table. "I have authority to compel witness testimony, examine property records, and conduct independent surveys of disputed land. Conrad Voss has been notified that he's under investigation for fraud related to land acquisitions and water rights claims." "How did he react?" Maylene asked. "His lawyer sent a letter calling the investigation politically motivated harassment. Standard response from men in his position: deny everything, attack the investigators, try to make this about persecution rather than evidence." Granger's expression was grim. "But the prosecutor isn't backing down. The notary fraud is too clear, the pattern too systematic. Voss is in real trouble and he knows it." "Which means he'll fight harder," Garrett said. "Undoubtedly. But fighting in court is different from operating in shadows. Every move he makes now is on record, subject to scrutiny. That limits his options considerably." Granger pulled out a list of properties. "I need to conduct field surveys of the disputed water sources, starting with the Henderson Ranch, then moving to the other properties Voss has filed claims against. I'll need property owners present to grant access and witness the surveys." "We can arrange that," Maylene said. "Tom Henderson is ready. So is Sarah Yates and the others who came forward." "Good. We start tomorrow at first light. I want to complete the field surveys before Voss has time to interfere or challenge our methodology." Granger's gaze moved between Garrett and Mei Lin. You should also know the prosecutor wants to schedule a preliminary hearing within 2 weeks. That's fast for the territorial system, which tells you how strong he thinks the case is. But it also means we have very little time to prepare. 2 weeks. 14 days to build an airtight case that would stand up against whatever legal firepower Voss could bring to bear. The timeline felt impossibly tight, but Garrett could see the strategic wisdom in it. Move fast enough that Voss couldn't marshal his full resources. Strike while the evidence was fresh and the witnesses still willing to testify. They spent the afternoon organizing logistics, property access schedules, witness coordination, document preparation. Granger proved to be methodical and thorough, asking questions that cut to the heart of each piece of evidence, probing for weaknesses that Voss's lawyers might exploit. The notary fraud is your strongest evidence, he said, reviewing the territorial registry letter for the third time. But we need to connect it directly to Voss. Right now, we can prove the documents are forged, but we need to prove he knew they were forged, that he deliberately used them to defraud property owners. How do we prove intent? Garrett asked. Pattern and timeline show that every property he acquired used the same forged notary credentials. Show that the legal language is identical across multiple supposedly independent transactions. Show that he personally benefited from each fraudulent claim. Granger tapped the timeline Mei Lin had created. This is good work. It establishes pattern. But we need witnesses who can testify that Voss himself presented these documents, that he made specific claims about water rights while knowing those claims were false. Sarah Yates can testify to that, Mei Lin said. Voss came to her property personally, made claims about water rights, showed her survey documents. If those documents contain forged notary stamps, that's direct evidence of his involvement. Excellent. I'll need to interview her formally, get her testimony on record. Granger made notes on a legal pad. Who else had direct contact with Voss during the fraud? They spent another hour identifying witnesses, building the web of testimony that would surround Voss with evidence of his own making. By the time they finished, the sun was setting and Garrett's head ached with the complexity of it all. Get some rest, Granger advised as they prepared to leave. Tomorrow starts early, and the field surveys will take all day. We'll be covering rough country on foot with equipment that's heavy and temperamental. Garrett and Mei Lin rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, both of them quiet with their own thoughts. The weight of what they'd set in motion pressed heavy. Not just the investigation itself, but the impact it would have on the entire territory. If they succeeded, Voss would be ruined and his victims would see justice. If they failed, Voss would emerge stronger than ever, emboldened by having survived federal scrutiny. We're not going to fail, Mei Lin said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. You sound certain. I am certain. The evidence is too strong, Granger is too competent, and we have something Voss doesn't. What's that? People willing to stand together instead of being picked off one by one. That's always been his advantage. Isolating his victims, making them think they're alone in the fight. But we've built a coalition. That changes everything. She was right. They'd done more than gather evidence. They'd created a community of resistance, brought together people who'd been scattered by fear, and made them into something unified and powerful. The next morning broke cold and clear, perfect weather for surveying. Granger and his assistants arrived at the Henderson Ranch with their equipment, theodolites, measuring chains, stakes, and flags for marking boundaries. Tom was waiting with Jack, both of them dressed for a day of hard work in rough country. We'll start with the spring Voss claims originates on his property, Granger said, spreading a survey map across the hood of his wagon. According to his filed claim, the source is here. He pointed to a spot marked on the map, about 200 yards inside what he's calling his eastern boundary. That's not where the spring is, Tom said flatly. The actual source is here. He pointed to a different location, clearly inside Henderson property. Has been for as long as anyone's known this land. My grandfather showed it to me when I was a boy. Then let's prove it. Granger gathered his equipment. Lead the way. They hiked north across Henderson land, following the creek upstream toward its source. The terrain grew steeper and rockier, requiring them to pick their way carefully through stands of pine and over ground littered with deadfall from winter storms. Mei Lin moved with surprising grace over the rough terrain, her eyes constantly scanning, reading the land with the same sharp attention she turned to everything else. Garrett found himself watching her as much as watching where he was going, the way she navigated obstacles, the way she paused occasionally to examine some detail that others might miss. After an hour of steady climbing, they reached the spring. It bubbled up from between two massive boulders, clear and cold, the source of the creek that flowed down through Henderson property and eventually joined the larger watershed that fed half the ranches in the territory. Granger immediately began setting up his equipment, taking measurements, consulting maps, making detailed notes. His assistants helped with the technical work while Tom provided historical context. When the spring had been discovered, how long it had been used, what surveys had been conducted in the past. "This spring is definitely on Henderson property," Granger announced after an hour of careful measurement. "I can confirm that with certainty. The coordinates place it a good 400 yards inside the Henderson boundary, not 200 yards inside Voss's claimed boundary." "So his survey was falsified," Garrett said. "Either falsified or so incompetent it amounts to the same thing. Either way, his water rights claim is baseless." Granger made more notes, his pencil moving quickly. "This is exactly the kind of concrete physical evidence we need. Voss claimed the spring was on his property. We can prove it's not. That undermines his entire legal position." They spent the rest of the day conducting similar surveys on 3 other disputed properties, documenting each water source with the same meticulous care. By the time they finished, the sun was dropping toward the western hills, and everyone was exhausted from hours of hiking and technical work. But the evidence they'd gathered was devastating. Every single water rights claim Voss had filed was based on falsified surveys that misrepresented the actual location of springs, creeks, and other water sources. The pattern was so consistent it could only be deliberate fraud. "He's done," Tom said quietly as they packed up equipment at the final survey site. "There's no way he talks his way out of this." "Don't underestimate what expensive lawyers can do," Granger cautioned. "But yes, this evidence is extremely damaging. Combined with the notary fraud and the witness testimony, we have a case that should result in criminal charges." They returned to town as darkness fell, tired but energized by the day's success. Granger retreated to his hotel room to compile his findings into an official report, while Garrett and Mylin headed to the saloon where they'd arranged to meet with the ranchers who'd agreed to testify. 6 people were waiting: Tom Henderson, Sarah Yates, and 4 others whose properties had been targeted by Voss. They looked nervous but determined, the expressions of people who'd decided that risking everything was better than losing everything by degrees. Granger completed the surveys, Garrett told them, keeping his voice low. "Every water rights claim Voss filed is based on falsified information. The springs and creeks he claims are on his property are actually on your properties, exactly where you've always said they were." Relief washed across the faces around the table. Sarah Yates actually laughed, a sound that held equal parts joy and disbelief. "So we were right," she said. "All along we were right, and he was just lying." "Yes, but proving we're right isn't the same as winning in court," Malin cautioned. "Voss will challenge everything. He'll attack our credibility, question Granger's methodology, try to introduce doubt wherever he can. We need to be prepared for that." "What do we need to do?" asked a rancher named Marcus Cole, whose property bordered Voss's southern holdings. "Tell the truth. Clearly, consistently, without embellishment or exaggeration. Granger will interview each of you formally tomorrow, getting your testimony on record. Just answer his questions honestly. Don't try to say what you think he wants to hear. Just tell him exactly what happened, what Voss said, what documents he showed you." They went around the table, each person sharing their story, while Malin took notes. The accounts were remarkably similar. Voss approaching with offers to buy, being refused, then returning weeks later with legal claims about water rights supported by official-looking documents. The pressure had been systematic and relentless, designed to break down resistance through a combination of legal intimidation and financial strain. He targeted widows and older ranchers, Sarah observed bitterly, people he thought would be too vulnerable to fight back. "Classic predator behavior," Malin said. "Choose victims who seem isolated and weak, then apply pressure until they break. It works because most people fight alone, but you're not alone anymore." The meeting broke up near midnight, with everyone agreeing to be available for Granger's formal interviews the following day. As the ranchers filed out into the night, Garrett caught Tom's arm. "You holding up all right?" he asked. Tom managed a tired smile. "Better than I have in months, truth be told. For the first time since Voss started pushing, I feel like we have a real chance of stopping him. We do, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. Voss knows he's cornered. Cornered animals are dangerous. So are angry ranchers who've had enough. Tom gripped Garrett's shoulder. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what matters. Garrett and Maylene rode home through darkness so complete it felt like riding through ink. The stars overhead provided barely enough light to follow the familiar trail, and the horses picked their way carefully over ground they knew from repetition rather than sight. He's going to make a move, Maylene said suddenly. Voss? He can't fight this in court. The evidence is too strong. So he'll try something else. Like what? Intimidation, bribery, maybe violence. Her voice was steady but serious. Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. When legal options fail, they turn to illegal ones. Garrett had been thinking the same thing. Voss had too much invested in his operation to simply walk away because a federal examiner had gathered damning evidence. He would fight back, and that fight might not stay confined to courtrooms and legal documents. We should be ready, he said. We will be. But we also can't let fear of what he might do stop us from seeing this through. They reached the ranch and took care of the horses before heading inside. The house felt warm and welcoming after the long, cold day, and Maylene had a fire going within minutes. Garrett collapsed into a chair while she made coffee, his body aching from hours of hiking rough terrain. You were right, he said as she handed him a steaming cup. About building something worth keeping. What we're doing, it's not just about stopping Voss. It's about proving that ordinary people can stand up to powerful men and win. Sometimes, Maylene corrected gently, we can win sometimes. Not always, but often enough that it's worth trying. Is that what happened with your father's land? You tried and couldn't win? Her expression grew distant. I tried too late. By the time I understood what was happening, the fraud was already complete. My father was already broken, and I had no resources to fight with. I was alone, inexperienced, and married to a man who was part of the problem. She met his eyes. But I learned, and I swore that if I ever got another chance to fight men like that, I would do it right. With evidence, with allies, with a plan that couldn't be broken by money or intimidation. You got your chance. We got our chance. This isn't my fight alone any more than it's yours alone. It belongs to every rancher Voss tried to destroy, every family he thought he could crush without consequence. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the fire crackle. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of weather changing. What happens after? Garrett asked. After the trial. After Voss is dealt with. You said you were heading to California, to family. Maylene was quiet for a long moment. I said that when I thought I was alone and running, but I'm not running anymore. And I'm not alone. So you'll stay. If you want me to. Garrett set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. I want you to. Not just for the fight against Voss, not just because you're useful or skilled or good at reading land. I want you to stay because this place is better with you in it. I'm better with you in it. Maylene's eyes softened. Eleanor was the love of your life. I can't replace that. I'm not asking you to replace anything. Eleanor's gone and nothing changes that. But life keeps moving forward, and I can either move with it or stay frozen in grief. You've shown me how to move forward, how to fight for something that matters, how to build instead of just maintaining what's left. Building is harder than maintaining. I know, but I'm ready for hard if it means having something worth protecting. Maylene reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was firm and warm, calloused from work but gentle in its intention. Then we build together, she said simply. After we finish tearing down what Voss created, we build something better. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday in the Territorial Courthouse, a building that tried to project dignity despite being relatively new and still carrying the rough edges of frontier construction. Granger had spent the intervening days compiling his survey findings into a comprehensive report, interviewing witnesses and working with the territorial prosecutor to prepare the case. Garrett, Maylene, and Tom arrived early, along with the other ranchers who'd agreed to testify. They gathered in a waiting room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, everyone dressed in their best clothes, everyone carrying the tension of knowing that what happened in the next few hours could determine the course of their lives. Conrad Voss arrived with 3 lawyers, all of them dressed in expensive suits that made the territorial courthouse look even more rough-hewn by comparison. Voss himself looked unruffled, almost amused, as if this were an inconvenient formality rather than a serious threat to everything he'd built. The hearing room was packed when they filed in. Word had spread through the territory that a major land fraud case was being heard, and people had come from as far as 50 miles away to watch. Some were genuinely interested in justice. Others just wanted to see a powerful man brought down. Either way, the room hummed with anticipation. Judge Margaret Halstead presided, a stern woman in her 60s who'd built a reputation for running a fair courtroom and tolerating no nonsense from lawyers who tried to waste her time. She called the hearing to order with a sharp crack of her gavel. This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with criminal charges against Conrad Voss for fraud related to land acquisitions and water rights claims. Mr. Granger, you may present your findings. Granger stood and walked to the front of the courtroom with the confident bearing of a man who knew his evidence was solid. He laid out the case methodically, the pattern of acquisitions, the forged notary credentials, the falsified surveys, the systematic targeting of vulnerable property owners. He presented the letter from the Territorial Notary Registry proving 3 notaries didn't exist and 2 others had never certified the documents in question. He showed survey maps comparing Voss's filed claims against the actual physical surveys Granger himself had conducted, demonstrating that every water rights claim was based on false information. Then he called witnesses. Tom Henderson testified about Voss's escalating pressure, the legal claims that contradicted decades of established property boundaries. Sarah Yates testified about Voss personally showing her forged documents and making claims he knew were false. One by one, the ranchers told their stories, and the pattern emerged with devastating clarity. Voss's lawyers objected frequently, challenging methodology, questioning witness credibility, demanding technical specifications. But Judge Halstead kept the proceedings focused, allowing legitimate questions while shutting down obvious attempts to derail through procedural gamesmanship. When Maylene was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with her back straight and her expression calm. The lead defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Caldwell, immediately went on the attack. Ms. Zhao, you have no formal education in surveying or land examination, correct? Correct. No legal training? None. Yet you've taken it upon yourself to investigate my client's business dealings and make serious accusations of fraud. On what authority? Maylene's eyes remained steady. On the authority of someone who's seen this exact scheme before, who watched her own family destroyed by men using the same tactics your client is using. I recognize the pattern because I've lived through it. Personal vendetta, then. Personal experience. There's a difference. Caldwell tried several more angles of attack, but Maylene refused to be rattled. She answered each question with precision, never embellishing, never retreating, simply stating facts that couldn't be disputed. When she described the identical notary stamps appearing under different names, she produced the documents themselves, laying them side by side for the judge to examine. These are not similar stamps, Maylene said clearly. These are identical stamps. Same size, same design, same manufacturing defect in the territorial seal. Only one physical stamp could produce these marks. Yet 5 different notary names are attached to documents bearing this identical stamp. That's not coincidence, that's fraud. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Voss's lawyers seemed momentarily at a loss for how to counter the simple, devastating logic of the evidence. Judge Halstead examined the documents herself, taking her time, comparing the stamps with a magnifying glass she produced from her bench. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. Mr. Caldwell, do you have an explanation for how 5 supposedly different notaries came to possess an identical stamp with the same unique defect? Caldwell conferred briefly with Voss, who whispered urgently in his ear. Then he straightened. Your Honor, we believe these documents may have been tampered with after the fact, that someone seeking to discredit my client has altered the original notary stamps to create the appearance of fraud. It was a desperate gambit, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Judge Halstead's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting that someone created perfect forgeries of forged documents in order to make the original forgeries look more forged. That's your position? We're suggesting the chain of custody for these documents is unclear, and therefore their evidentiary value is questionable. The chain of custody is the Territorial Land Office, where they've been stored since filing. Are you suggesting the Land Office is part of a conspiracy against your client? Caldwell had no good answer to that. He sat down, and Voss's confident expression had finally cracked, showing something harder and more desperate underneath. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence was too strong, too systematic, too thoroughly documented to dismiss or explain away. When Judge Halstead finally called for a recess to consider the evidence, everyone in the courtroom knew what her decision would be. She returned 30 minutes later and delivered her ruling with the firm clarity of someone who'd seen enough frontier justice to recognize the real thing when it appeared. Having reviewed the evidence presented, I find sufficient cause to believe that Conrad Voss engaged in systematic fraud involving forged documents, false water rights claims, and deliberate misrepresentation for the purpose of acquiring property through illegal means. This case will proceed to trial. Mr. Voss, you are hereby ordered to cease all land acquisition activities pending resolution of these charges. Additionally, all properties acquired through the disputed water rights claims are subject to review and potential reversal of sale. The gavel came down with finality. Around the courtroom, people erupted in conversation, some celebrating, some shocked, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Voss stood frozen for a moment, his face pale with rage. Then he turned and strode from the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow. Garrett felt Maylene's hand find his, her grip tight with emotion that matched his own. They'd done it. Not won completely, the trial still lay ahead, but they'd proven the fraud was real, had forced it into the light where it couldn't be hidden or denied. Outside the courthouse, the ranchers who'd testified gathered in a loose group, everyone talking at once, the relief and triumph palpable. Sarah Yates was crying openly, years of fear and pressure finally releasing. Tom Henderson stood with his arm around Jack's shoulders, both of them wearing expressions of fierce satisfaction. Granger emerged from the courthouse and made his way through the crowd to Garrett and Maylene. "That was excellent work," he said simply. "All of you." The judge had no choice but to order a trial. The evidence was too compelling to dismiss. "What happens now?" Garrett asked. "Now the real fight begins. Voss will bring everything he has to the trial. More lawyers, more money, more attempts to delay and obfuscate. But you've built a foundation he can't shake. The notary fraud is documented. The survey falsifications are proven. The pattern is undeniable." Granger's expression was serious but optimistic. "You've given the territory a chance at real justice. What you do with that chance is up to all of you." The crowd began dispersing as the afternoon wore on, people heading back to their ranches and their lives with a lightness that hadn't been there before. Garrett and Maylene rode home in comfortable silence, the weight of what they'd accomplished settling over them like a warm blanket. The ranch appeared as they crested the final hill, and Garrett saw it with new eyes, not as a memorial to what he'd lost, but as a foundation for what could be built. The fences they'd repaired together, the garden Maylene had brought back to life, the house that no longer felt like a tomb, but like a home, beginning to wake from a long sleep. They took care of the horses and went inside as the sun began its descent. Maylene started dinner while Garrett built a fire, and the domestic rhythm felt natural, earned, like something they'd been doing together for years, rather than weeks. "We're not done yet," Maylene said as they sat down to eat. "The trial will be harder. Voss will fight with everything he has." "I know, but today proved we can win, that the truth actually matters, that evidence can overcome money and influence. Sometimes, when good people work together and refuse to give up." She smiled across the table at him. "We did that. All of us. We refused to give up." After dinner, they sat by the fire and talked about the future, the trial that lay ahead, the ranches that might be restored to their rightful owners, the community they'd helped build through shared struggle. But they also talked about smaller things, personal things, the kind of future that involved two people building a life together rather than just surviving in proximity. "I need to tell you something," Maylene said eventually, her tone shifting to something more serious. "About my father's ranch, the one that was stolen." "All right. The ruling today. The judge's order that properties acquired through fraud are subject to review and potential reversal. that applies to more than just Voss's recent acquisitions. Her hands twisted in her lap. If the fraud is proven systematic, if we can show it extends back further than the cases we've documented, then older cases could be reopened, cases like my father's. Understanding hit Garrett like cold water. You want to use this trial to reopen your father's case. Not just want, need. The men who destroyed my father used the same scheme Voss is using. If we can prove the scheme itself is fraudulent, if we can establish legal precedent that forged notary credentials and false water rights claims constitute grounds for voiding sales, then my father's case becomes viable again. Her eyes met his, intense and pleading. I know it's asking a lot. I know it expands the scope of what we're fighting for. But this is my chance, maybe my only chance, to restore what was stolen from my family. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. Expanding the case meant more complexity, more legal battles, more time and energy invested in a fight that was already consuming everything they had. But it also meant justice for more than just the ranchers currently under threat. It meant holding accountable everyone who'd ever used these tactics to steal land and destroy families. How far back does your father's case go? He asked. 3 years. The land was taken through foreclosure after my father couldn't afford to fight the water rights fraud. The man who bought it at auction was the same man who'd engineered the fraud in the first place, a Denver investor named Lawrence Brennan. Brennan? That's one of the fake notary names on Voss's documents. Maylene nodded. I noticed that too. It's possible Voss learned the scheme from Brennan, or they worked together. Either way, if we can connect them, we can show this fraud operation is bigger than just Voss acting alone. It was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Brilliant because it turned their case from a single prosecution into an exposé of an entire criminal network. Terrifying because it made them targets of more than just Voss. It made them threats to everyone who'd profited from land fraud across the territory. We do it, Garrett said finally. We open this up as wide as it needs to go. Your father deserves justice just as much as Tom Henderson or Sarah Yates. If we can get it for him, we should try. Relief and gratitude flooded Maylene's face. She moved around the table and embraced him, and Garrett held her close, feeling the tension in her body slowly release. Thank you, she whispered against his shoulder. Thank you for understanding why this matters. Of course it matters. You matter. He pulled back enough to see her face. We're in this together, remember? Your fight is my fight. Your family's justice is part of what we're building. They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, and Garrett felt the final pieces of his grief loosening their grip on his heart. Eleanor would always be part of him, would always matter. But life was offering him something new, not a replacement for what he'd lost, but a different kind of future built on partnership and shared purpose. Outside, the night deepened and the stars emerged in their vast, scattered glory. Inside, two people who'd found each other through circumstance and choice planned for battles yet to come, and victories not yet won, building together what neither could have built alone. The connection to Lawrence Brennan came faster than anyone expected. Granger found it buried in territorial land records 3 days after the preliminary hearing, a document trail showing that Brennan and Voss had been business partners 5 years earlier, jointly purchasing and reselling properties across 3 counties before apparently dissolving their partnership. They worked together, Granger said, spreading the documents across Garrett's kitchen table. Bought properties, filed fraudulent water rights claims, pressured owners to sell at depressed prices, then resold at profit. The pattern is identical to what Voss has been doing alone for the past 2 years. Maylene leaned over the documents, her eyes moving rapidly across names and dates. This property here, the Chen Ranch, purchased 4 years ago through foreclosure. That was my father's neighbor. The water rights claim that destroyed my father's operation was filed by Brennan 3 months before this purchase. They were working the same territory at the same time, Garrett said, seeing the pattern emerge. Brennan took your father's land while Voss worked other properties nearby. They divided the region between them. Until something made them split, Granger added. The partnership dissolved 2 years ago, right around the time Voss started operating independently. My guess is they had a falling out over profits or territory. Can we use this? Maylene asked, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Can we prove Brennan's fraud and use it to reopen my father's case? Granger was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Possibly. If we can show the fraud was systematic and involved both men, and if we can prove your father's foreclosure was the direct result of false water rights claims, then yes, there's legal precedent for voiding the sale and restoring the property. But, Maylene pressed, hearing the hesitation, but it expands the case significantly. We'd be prosecuting not just Voss for recent fraud, but a criminal conspiracy spanning years and involving multiple parties. That means more witnesses, more documentation, more opportunities for the defense to create doubt and delay. It also means real justice, Maylene said firmly. Not just stopping Voss, but dismantling the entire operation and restoring what was stolen from everyone they destroyed. Garrett watched her face as she spoke, seeing the fierce determination burning behind her controlled expression. This wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. It was personal, a chance to undo the harm that had shattered her family and sent her running across the territory with nothing but bruises and documents stolen from her husband's office. We present it to the prosecutor, he said, making the decision. Let him decide if the case is strong enough to pursue. But Maylene's right. If we can take down the whole network, we should. Granger gathered the documents carefully. I'll schedule a meeting for tomorrow, but you should know, Voss and Brennan will fight this harder than anything we've seen so far. We're not just threatening one man's operation now. We're threatening an entire criminal enterprise that's probably made them both wealthy. The prosecutor, a sharp-minded man named Daniel Warren, listened to their expanded case with the focused intensity of someone who recognized an opportunity when it appeared. He was 40, relatively young for his position, and had built a reputation for taking on difficult cases that other prosecutors avoided. This is ambitious, he said when they finished presenting. Prosecuting Voss alone would have been straightforward. The evidence is solid, the pattern is clear. But connecting him to Brennan, proving conspiracy, reopening cases that are years old, that's complex litigation that could take months. It's also the right thing to do, Maylene said quietly. My father lost everything because of fraudulent water rights claims filed by Brennan. If those claims were part of a systematic conspiracy, then the sale that resulted from his foreclosure should be voided and his property restored. Warren studied her for a long moment. You understand that even if we prove the fraud, recovery might not be simple. Property changes hands, improvements are made. New owners establish legitimate claims. Untangling it all could be legally messy. Messy is better than leaving it buried, Maylene replied. Justice delayed isn't the same as justice denied, but it's close. Every day we wait is another day the people they hurt live with the consequences while the men who destroyed them profit. Warren smiled faintly at that. You should have been a lawyer, Miss Zhao. I learned from experience. That's a harder school than law college. Indeed. Warren pulled the documents closer, reviewing key sections again. All right, I'll pursue this. But I need everything you can find connecting Voss and Brennan, correspondence, joint property holdings, shared legal representation, anything that proves they were working together rather than operating independently. How long do we have? Garrett asked. The trial is set for 6 weeks from now. That's not much time to build a conspiracy case on top of the fraud prosecution we're already preparing. We'll need to work fast and stay organized. They left the prosecutor's office with new purpose and a timeline that felt impossibly tight. 6 weeks to prove a conspiracy that had operated for years, to connect scattered pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative that could stand up in court against lawyers who would fight every inch of the way. The next month became a blur of investigation and preparation. Garrett and Maylene worked alongside Granger, traveling across the territory to interview victims of Brennan's operations, gathering documents from land offices in 3 counties, building the web of evidence that connected Voss and Brennan to a systematic criminal enterprise. They found families who'd lost ranches to manufactured debt, widows who'd been pressured to sell through false legal claims, aging farmers who'd watched their life's work auctioned off to satisfy fraudulent judgments. The stories were heartbreaking in their similarity, people isolated and vulnerable, targeted by men who understood that the legal system could be weaponized against those who couldn't afford to defend themselves. Tom Henderson became their liaison to the ranching community, organizing meetings where victims could share information and testimony. Sarah Yates opened her home as a gathering place, providing food and support to families who were reliving trauma by coming forward. The coalition they'd built grew stronger and more determined with each passing week, but resistance grew as well. Voss's lawyers filed motion after motion seeking to delay the trial, to suppress evidence, to exclude witness testimony. Granger received threatening letters suggesting he leave the territory for his own safety. 2 ranchers who'd agreed to testify found their cattle mysteriously poisoned, their barns damaged by fires that might or might not have been accidental. "They're trying to break us through fear," Maylene said one evening as they reviewed reports of the latest intimidation attempts. "Make people too scared to testify, too worried about retaliation to keep fighting." "Is it working?" Garrett asked. "Some people are wavering, but most are angry. You can only push people so far before fear turns into rage, and rage makes people dangerous." She looked up from the papers. "We're close to something Voss and Brennan can't tolerate. They're getting desperate." The breakthrough came 2 weeks before trial, when Granger discovered a cache of correspondence in the Denver Land Office archives. Letters between Voss and Brennan discussing property acquisitions, dividing territories, coordinating their timing to avoid appearing connected. The letters were damning, clear evidence of conspiracy, of systematic fraud planned and executed over years. "This is it," Warren said when Granger presented the letters. "This proves they were working together, that the fraud wasn't isolated incidents but organized crime. With this, we can prosecute both of them and seek to void every sale they executed through false claims." "Will Brennan even come to trial?" Tom asked. "He's in Denver. What's to stop him from just staying there?" "I've already requested extradition," Warren replied. "Colorado authorities will arrest him based on these letters, and he'll be transported here to face charges. He can't hide behind distance anymore." The news spread through the territory like wildfire. Conrad Voss and Lawrence Brennan, 2 wealthy men who'd seemed untouchable, were both going to face trial for systematic land fraud. Properties stolen through false claims would be reviewed. Families destroyed by their schemes would have a chance at restoration. Garrett watched the impact ripple through the community and felt something like hope taking root. This was bigger than his ranch or Tom's water rights, or even Maylene's father's stolen land. This was about proving that the law could actually work for ordinary people. That justice wasn't just a concept reserved for those with money and connections. The day before trial, they gathered at Garrett's ranch. All the witnesses, the ranchers who'd agreed to testify, Granger and his team, even Warren stopping by to review final preparations. The house felt full in ways it hadn't since Eleanor died, alive with voices and purpose, and the kind of determined energy that came from people united by shared struggle. Maylene moved through the crowd with coffee and food, and Garrett watched her engage with each person, offering encouragement to Sarah Yates, discussing strategy with Tom Henderson, reviewing testimony with nervous ranchers who'd never spoken in a courtroom before. She'd become the heart of this effort, the person who held everything together through organization and empathy and unwavering belief that what they were doing mattered. As darkness fell and people began leaving for their own homes, Garrett found himself alone with Maylene on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. "Tomorrow changes everything," she said quietly. "Tomorrow we finish what we started. Or we lose everything we've built." She turned to face him. "Voss and Brennan will have the best lawyers money can buy. They'll attack our evidence, our credibility, our motives. It's going to be brutal. I know, but we have something they don't." "What's that?" "The truth. And people willing to stand up and speak it, no matter the cost." He took her hand. "You've given these families something they'd lost. The belief that fighting back is possible. Win or lose tomorrow, that matters." Maylene leaned against his shoulder, and they stood together in the darkness, gathering strength for the battle ahead. The courtroom was packed when they arrived the next morning. Every seat filled, people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. Judge Halstead had to call for order twice before the noise subsided enough for proceedings to begin. Conrad Voss sat at the defense table with his legal team, his expression carefully neutral. Beside him, freshly extradited from Colorado, Lawrence Brennan looked older and more worn, the arrogance that had characterized his earlier operations replaced by something harder and more desperate. Warren opened with a methodical presentation of the conspiracy, showing the partnership between Voss and Brennan, the coordinated property acquisitions, the systematic use of forged documents, and false water rights claims. He presented the letters discovered in Denver, reading key passages aloud that left no doubt the men had been working together to defraud property owners across the territory. Then came the witnesses. One by one, the ranchers Voss had targeted took the stand and told their stories. Tom Henderson described the pressure tactics, the false legal claims, the way Voss had tried to manufacture a crisis where none existed. Sarah Yates testified about being shown forged documents and being pressured to sell through manufactured fear. Others added their voices, each story adding weight to the pattern of systematic fraud. The defense attorneys fought hard, challenging every piece of testimony, questioning motives, suggesting the witnesses were coordinating their stories or exaggerating for financial gain. But Warren was prepared, countering each attack with documentary evidence that corroborated the testimony, land office records, survey maps, the damning letters between Voss and Brennan. When Maylene took the stand on the second day of trial, the courtroom fell silent. Everyone knew her story by now. The Chinese woman whose father had been destroyed by Brennan's fraud, who'd married into the criminal enterprise without knowing it, who'd stolen documents and fled across the territory to escape and fight back. Warren led her through her testimony carefully, establishing her father's ranch, the water rights fraud that had destroyed it, her discovery of her husband's involvement, her decision to gather evidence and leave. Miss Zhao, can you identify the man who engineered the fraud that destroyed your father's ranch? Maylene's eyes moved to Brennan. Lawrence Brennan. He filed false water rights claims stating that the spring feeding my father's property actually originated on land he'd purchased upstream. The claims were supported by forged survey documents bearing notary stamps that don't exist in the territorial registry. My father couldn't afford to fight the legal challenges. He lost everything. And your husband worked for Mr. Brennan? Yes. He was a land agent in Brennan's Denver office. He helped identify properties to target, researched owners who would be vulnerable to pressure, coordinated the timing of fraudulent claims. Her voice remained steady, factual. When I discovered what he was doing, I confronted him. He struck me and told me to forget what I'd learned. Instead, I took documents from his office proving the fraud, and I left. The defense attorney, a Denver lawyer named Harrison who represented Brennan, stood for cross-examination. He was smooth and polished, exactly the kind of legal talent that money could buy. Miss Zhao, you stole confidential business documents from your husband's office, correct? I took evidence of criminal activity. Documents you weren't authorized to access. Evidence of fraud doesn't require authorization to expose. You fled your marriage and came to Montana seeking revenge against the men you blame for your father's losses. I came to Montana seeking justice. There's a difference. Harrison tried several more angles, but Maylene refused to be rattled. She answered each question with precision, never defensive, never emotional, simply stating facts that couldn't be shaken by legal maneuvering. When Harrison finally sat down, looking frustrated, Warren stood for redirect. Miss Zhao, the documents you took from your husband's office, are they among the evidence presented in this trial? Yes. They show the coordination between Brennan and Voss, the systematic nature of their fraud, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable property owners. And why did you risk everything to bring this evidence forward? For the first time, emotion flickered across Maylene's face. Because my father was a good man who built something from nothing, and men like Brennan and Voss destroyed him for profit. Because I watched him give up and fade away, and I couldn't live with knowing I'd done nothing to stop the people who'd broken him. Because justice delayed is still justice worth seeking, and silence in the face of wrong is the same as accepting it. The courtroom was absolutely silent when she finished. Even Judge Halstead seemed moved, her stern expression softening fractionally. The trial continued for another week. Granger presented his survey evidence proving that every water rights claim Voss and Brennan had filed was based on falsified information. Document examiners testified about the forged notary stamps. Land office clerks confirmed that the same fraudulent stamps appeared across multiple counties and years, establishing pattern and conspiracy. The defense fought back with their own experts, claiming the surveys were legitimate differences of interpretation, that the notary issues were clerical errors rather than fraud, that there was no proof Voss and Brennan had coordinated their activities despite working in the same region. But the evidence was too strong, too systematic, too thoroughly documented to dismiss. The letters between Voss and Brennan alone proved coordination. The forged notary stamps proved deliberate fraud. The pattern of targeting vulnerable owners proved intent. On the final day, both sides presented closing arguments. The defense painted Voss and Brennan as successful businessmen being persecuted by failed ranchers looking for someone to blame for their own poor management. Warren painted them as predators who'd weaponized the legal system against the defenseless, who'd built wealth on the broken backs of families they'd deliberately destroyed. Judge Halstead recessed to consider the evidence. The wait was excruciating. 3 hours of sitting in the courthouse hallway while the judge reviewed documents and testimony, weighing evidence against the high bar required for criminal conviction. When she finally called everyone back into the courtroom, her expression was set and serious. "I have reviewed all evidence presented in this trial," she began. "The documentation of forged notary credentials is irrefutable. The pattern of false water rights claims is systematic and deliberate. The letters between Conrad Voss and Lawrence Brennan prove coordination and conspiracy. The testimony from victims establishes harm and intent." She paused, her gaze moving to the defense table where Voss and Brennan sat frozen. "I find Conrad Voss and Lawrence Brennan guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty of using forged documents to deprive property owners of their legal rights, and guilty of systematic criminal enterprise designed to illegally acquire land through false legal claims." The courtroom erupted. People shouted, cried, embraced. Sarah Yates collapsed into tears of relief. Tom Henderson stood with his arm around Jack, both of them looking like they couldn't quite believe what they'd just heard. Judge Halstead's gavel cracked repeatedly, restoring order. When the room finally quieted, she continued, "All property sales resulting from the defendant's fraudulent water rights claims are hereby voided and will be returned to their original owners or their legal heirs. The Territorial Land Office will conduct a comprehensive review of all transactions involving either defendant, with authority to void additional sales where fraud can be proven. Both defendants are remanded to territorial custody pending sentencing." She brought the gavel down with finality, and Conrad Voss's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. He lunged toward Warren, shouting threats, before being restrained by court officers. Brennan simply sat with his head in his hands, the image of a man who'd finally run out of escape routes. Outside the courthouse, the celebration was overwhelming. Families who'd thought they'd lost everything for good now faced the possibility of restoration. Ranchers who'd been forced to sell found themselves with legal standing to reclaim their land. The entire territory seemed to shift beneath the weight of justice finally delivered. Warren found Garrett and Maylin in the crowd and pulled them aside. "Miss Zhao, I need you to file a formal claim for your father's property. With Brennan's conviction, the sale that resulted from his fraudulent water rights claim is void. The land reverts to your father or to you as his heir if he's unable to manage it." Maylene's hand found Garrett's and gripped tight. "I'll file tomorrow, and I'll bring my father here. Let him see that justice is possible, that fighting back isn't futile. Do that. He deserves to know his daughter defeated the men who destroyed him." The next weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and property restorations. Garrett's ranch was officially cleared of any claims. Voss's filing against Tom Henderson was voided, eliminating any question about water rights or boundary disputes. Tom's property was restored to full clear title. Sarah Yates received confirmation that her ranch was secure, that no future claims could threaten her children's inheritance. But the most profound restoration happened when Maylene's father arrived from Denver, brought by stage and rail to the territory where he'd once built a life before losing everything. He was 70 now, gray and worn, moving like a man who'd lost his center of gravity years ago and never quite recovered it. Maylene met him at the stage station and brought him to the land office, where the clerk handed over the deed to his property. Fully restored, all fraudulent claims dismissed, his ownership clear and undisputed. He held the document with shaking hands and wept. "I thought it was gone forever," he said in Mandarin, Maylene translating for Garrett, who stood witness to the reunion. "I thought I had failed you, failed your mother's memory, failed everything I'd built." "You didn't fail," Maylene said gently. "You were attacked by criminals who used the law as a weapon. But the law can also deliver justice. And it has." They took him to the property, driving out in a borrowed wagon because he was too frail to ride. The land had changed in 3 years. The house stood empty, the fields overgrown, everything showing the neglect of abandonment. But the bones were good, the springs still flowed clear and strong, and the land itself waited patiently for someone to bring it back to life. "I'm too old to work it myself," Maylene's father said. standing in what had once been his dooryard. But perhaps you, my daughter, you could restore what was lost. Maylin looked at Garrett, a question in her eyes. They'd been moving towards something for months now, building a partnership that went beyond friendship or convenience. But they hadn't spoken directly about the future, about what came after the fight was won. We could work both properties, Garrett said carefully. Your father's ranch and mine. They're not far apart. With enough help, we could manage both, keep them in operation while your father lives here and rebuild slowly. We? Maylin asked softly. We. If you'll stay, if you'll build this with me, not just the ranches, but a life, a partnership, a future. Maylin's father watched them both with eyes that had seen too much loss, but hadn't forgotten how to recognize hope. She has told me about you, Mr. Rowan, about what you've built together, how you fought beside her when you could have turned her away. That is not a small thing. Your daughter saved more than just these ranches, Garrett replied. She saved me from disappearing into grief, showed me that life doesn't end just because someone we love does. I want to build something with her that honors both what we've lost and what we've found. Maylin's father nodded slowly, then placed his hand over theirs where they joined between them. Then you have my blessing. Build something strong. Make it last. The wedding happened 2 months later in Bitter Creek's small church, attended by the entire community that had fought together and won. Tom Henderson stood as witness. Sarah Yates brought flowers from her garden. Granger traveled from Helena to attend. Even Warren came, bringing official notice that Voss and Brennan had both been sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison and stripped of all assets acquired through fraud. Maylin wore a dress of deep blue silk that she'd sewn herself, simple and elegant. Garrett wore his best suit, still feeling the weight of Eleanor's memory but no longer crushed by it. She would have approved of this, he thought, would have liked Maylin, would have understood that honoring the past didn't mean refusing the future. They spoke vows that promised partnership and mutual respect, understanding that what they were building together was different from what either had known before, but no less valuable for the difference. When the ceremony concluded and they walked out into Montana sunshine, the crowd that had gathered erupted in celebration. The months that followed were hard work, but good work. They divided their time between the two ranches, bringing Maylin's father's property back from neglect while maintaining Garrett's operation. Tom Henderson and Jack helped with the heavy labor. Sarah Yates coordinated the community support, organizing work parties and shared resources. The territory that had been fractured by Voss's predation came together in reconstruction, proving that what could be destroyed by greed could be rebuilt by cooperation. Maylin's father regained strength slowly, working in the garden he'd once tended, teaching his grandson, for by the end of that first year, Maylin was pregnant, about water management and land stewardship and the importance of fighting for what matters. I gave up once, he told Garrett one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over land that had been stolen and then restored. I let them break me because I thought fighting was futile. But my daughter showed me that surrender is a choice, not an inevitability. She could have accepted what happened. Instead, she fought. And she won. We won, Garrett corrected. All of us together. Yes, that is the lesson. One person alone can be broken, but people united cannot be. He smiled. You've given my daughter a home. More than that, you've given her a cause worth fighting for, and a partner worthy of her strength. That is no small gift. The territory began to heal. Properties were restored to their rightful owners. Families that had been scattered came back to land that had been stolen and then returned. The legal precedent established by Voss and Brennan's conviction made it harder for future predators to use the same tactics. Granger stayed on permanently, establishing a territorial land office focused on protecting small property owners from fraud. 5 years after that first night when Maylin walked into Garrett's kitchen with a torn dress and a proposal to trade work for shelter, the two ranches had become one thriving operation. Maylin's father lived in the restored house on his original property, tending gardens and teaching his grandson about the land. The community they'd helped save gathered regularly, bound by shared struggle and shared victory. Standing on the porch of the house he'd once shared with Eleanor and now shared with Maylin, Garrett watched his son playing in the yard while Maylin worked in the garden she'd brought back to life years before. The land was green and productive, the fences strong, the future secure. Tom Henderson rode up the trail, accompanied by Sarah Yates and several other ranchers who'd become family through the bonds forged in fighting together. They'd come for the monthly gathering that had become tradition, sharing meals, discussing land management, supporting each other the way they'd learned to do when survival had depended on unity. Thinking about the past, Maylene asked, joining Garrett on the porch. Thinking about how much has changed, how what started as 3 nights became a lifetime. She slipped her hand into his. You let me stay when you could have sent me away. That choice changed everything. Well, you showed me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that sometimes the worst moments are just preludes to something better. He pulled her close. We built this together, something stronger than what either of us lost. The sun continued its descent, painting the Montana sky in shades of copper and gold. In the yard, their son laughed as Tom's grandson showed him how to rope a fence post. Inside the house, Maylene's father prepared tea with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that the smallest rituals matter most. Across the valley, other ranches showed signs of life and prosperity, the entire territory transformed by what had started with one woman's refusal to accept injustice and one man's decision to fight beside her. They had won more than a legal case. They had proven that ordinary people could stand against powerful predators and prevail. The communities built on mutual support were stronger than empires built on greed. That justice delayed was still justice worth seeking, and that fighting back was always better than surrendering to despair. The land that Voss and Brennan had tried to steal through lies now thrived under the care of people who understood that true ownership came not from paper and fraud, but from sweat and stewardship and the willingness to defend what matters. As darkness fell and the gathering moved inside for dinner and conversation, and the kind of fellowship that came from shared victory, Garrett felt the last remnants of his old grief transform into something else. Gratitude for what he'd had with Eleanor, and gratitude for what he'd found with Maylene. Both were real. Both mattered. And honoring one didn't diminish the other. They had taken brokenness, his from loss, hers from betrayal and displacement, and forged it into something whole and strong. They had turned isolation into community, defeat into victory, grief into hope. The story that began with smoke rising from a cold chimney and a stranger in the kitchen had become something larger than either of them could have imagined. It became a testament to the power of refusing to quit, of standing together when standing alone meant certain defeat, of believing that justice was possible even when the world seemed designed to crush it. And as they sat down to dinner surrounded by family and friends and the community they'd helped save, Garrett and Maylene knew that what they'd built would last. Not because it was perfect or easy, but because it was founded on truth, defended with courage, and sustained by the kind of partnership that made the impossible simply difficult and the difficult merely challenging. The ranches thrived. The community grew stronger. And two people who'd found each other in darkness built a life together in the light, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it together and refusing to let it win.